This is a few hours of South Park episodes that pushed the boundaries of what you can say about race on television. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's start our video with a deep dive into the single most uncomfortable episode South Park has ever aired about racism. With apologies to Jesse Jackson is the episode where Randy Marsh says the most forbidden word in the English language on live national television, and somehow the show turns it into one of the smartest commentaries on race relations that has ever been broadcast on basic cable. I'm going to walk you through every detail of this episode because when you really break it down, it's actually kind of genius how Trey Parker and Matt Stone pulled this off without getting canceled. So here's the setup. South Park has been on the air since August 13th, 1997. It was literally the first weekly television program in history to receive a TVMA rating. By the time this episode came around, the show had already spent a decade offending every group imaginable. Christians, Scientologists, celebrities, politicians, entire countries. They got banned in India in 2010 for extreme vulgarity. They got the entire franchise scrubbed from the Chinese internet in 2019 after making fun of Hollywood bowing to Beijing. But race was always the one topic where even Parker and Stone had to be careful. They knew that messing it up would be different from making fun of Tom Cruise or Kanye West. Race hits differently in America. It hits deeper. Parker and Stone had actually wanted to make an episode centered on the racial slur for years. They kept trying to crack the story but could never get past the opening scene. They had this image in their heads of Randy on Wheel of Fortune, and they knew it was funny, but they couldn't figure out where the story went after that. Then, in November 2006, something happened that changed everything. Comedian Michael Richards, the guy who played Kramer on Seinfeld, had this infamous meltdown at the Laugh Factory in Los Angeles. He started screaming racial slurs at black audience members who were heckling him. Not in an ironic way, not in a comedic way, but with genuine anger and hatred behind it. The video went viral, the whole country was talking about it. And then Richards did the thing that really set Parker and Stone off. He went on Jesse Jackson's radio show to apologize. That's what cracked the episode open for them. Not the slur itself, but the apology ritual. The way American culture had created this whole performance around racial forgiveness, where a white person says something terrible, goes to a black authority figure, performs contrition, and then expects everything to go back to normal. Parker and Stone thought the whole thing was absurd, and they had a secret weapon on the writing staff, who felt even more strongly about it. Vernon Chatman, a staff writer who is half black, was particularly outraged by the idea that apologizing to Jesse Jackson somehow represented apologizing to all black people. Chapman's frustration became the emotional core of the episode. His exact sentiment that Jesse Jackson is not the ambassador of black people became the most important line in the script. The episode aired on March 7th, 2007. It was the season premiere of South Park's 11th season, the 154th episode overall. And it opens with one of the most brilliantly constructed comedy scenes in the show's history. Randy is on Wheel of Fortune. He's made it to the bonus round. The episode is airing live, which means his family is watching from the audience and the entire town of South Park is watching from home. The category is people who annoy you. Randy is given the letters R, T, S, L, and E. He asks for B, N, G, and O. This fills in almost every letter in the puzzle, leaving him staring at a board that reads N blank Gers. Now here's where the genius of the scene kicks in. A black camera operator in the studio stares daggers at Randy. The audience goes silent. Randy is visibly sweating. He knows what it looks like. He's hesitant, uncomfortable, unsure whether the answer is what he thinks it is. The timer's counting down. The host is pushing him to answer, and Randy, panicking under pressure, blurts out exactly what you think he blurts out. The reaction is immediate. His family is horrified. The audience is stunned. Millions of viewers across the country are shocked. And Randy gets the answer wrong. The correct answer was naggers, people who nag. Randy said the most offensive word in American culture on live television because he panicked, and he wasn't even right. What makes this opening so effective is that it puts the audience in an impossible position. You're laughing because the setup is absurd and the timing is perfect. But you're also cringing because you know the word carries real weight. Parker and Stone understood that the comedy and the discomfort aren't separate things. They're the same thing. The episode works because it makes you feel both at once. The fallout is immediate and total. Stan goes to school the next day knowing his father just said the word on live television. Cartman, being Cartman, immediately tries to weaponize the situation. He points out that Tolkien, their black classmate, is probably going to want to beat the crap out of Stan. When Stan tries to talk to Tolkien and explain that his dad isn't racist, just stupid, and that it's not a big deal, Tolkien pushes back. He tells Stan that it is a big deal, that Stan doesn't understand what it feels like when that word comes out, and that Stan shouldn't be the one deciding whether it matters or not. Cartman, watching from the sidelines, tries to escalate things into what he gleefully calls a race war, running around screaming, race war, it's on." When Tolkien simply walks away instead of fighting, Cartman declares it a forfeit and runs off screaming, "Whites win." That's Cartman in a nutshell. He doesn't care about the actual issue. He just wants to see people fight. Meanwhile, Randy goes through this elaborate apology tour that perfectly mirrors what Michael Richards did in real life. He visits Jesse Jackson's office to apologize. Jackson bends over his desk and tells Randy to kiss his butt. Literally, Randy does it, and a photograph is taken and published in the news. When Stan tells Tolkien that everything should be fine now because his dad apologized to Jesse Jackson, Tolkien delivers that Vernon Chapman line, "Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people." And Stan, genuinely confused, responds with one of the funniest lines in the episode, "He told my dad he was." That exchange is doing something really sophisticated. It's exposing the absurdity of how white America processes racial incidents. The assumption that there's one authority figure who can grant forgiveness on behalf of an entire race. The belief that performing a public apology ritual erases the impact of the original act. Stan genuinely thinks the Jesse Jackson apology fixed everything because that's how his culture has taught him racial reconciliation works. You mess up, you apologize to the designated representative, you move on. But Tolkien knows that's not how it works. The word still hurts, regardless of who accepted the apology. The show then introduces a parallel subplot that mirrors the main story in a really clever way. The school hires Dr. David Nelson, a little person, to give a sensitivity seminar to the students. The moment Dr. Nelson walks on stage, Cartman bursts into uncontrollable laughter. He cannot stop. He laughs through the entire presentation, making it impossible for Dr. Nelson to teach anything. The other kids are uncomfortable, the teachers are mortified, but Cartman genuinely cannot help himself. Dr. Nelson is patient at first, believing Cartman will tire himself out, but eventually loses his composure and screams at him. This subplot exists to create a parallel. Just as Randy accidentally used a racial slur and can't understand why his apology didn't fix things, Cartman is using cruel language against someone with a physical difference and can't be taught to stop through conventional sensitivity training. The episode is asking whether you can actually educate cruelty out of people, or whether some people are just going to be terrible regardless of how many seminars you throw at them. Randy's storyline gets even worse. He goes to a comedy club where a black comedian singles him out and calls him the N-word guy. Suddenly, everyone in South Park is calling Randy that. He's refused service at stores, he's harassed on the street. He becomes a social outcast defined entirely by that one moment on Wheel of Fortune. Randy experiences what it's like to have a slur attached to your identity, to be reduced to a single word that follows you everywhere you go. But here's the thing the episode understands. Randy's experience is not the same as what black people go through. Randy's suffering is temporary and self-inflicted. He said the word. He created this situation. The episode never pretends that Randy being called N-word guy is equivalent to the actual impact of racism. It's showing what happens when a white person gets a tiny taste of what it feels like to be defined by a word, and even that small taste is enough to destroy his social life. Randy tries everything to rehabilitate his image. He opens the Randy Marsh African American Scholarship Foundation. He goes to poetry slams. He does everything the modern playbook of racial reconciliation suggests. None of it works. Eventually, he's chased by rednecks who are angry at him for slandering an entire race. He's rescued by a group of other N-word guys led by none other than Michael Richards, the real comedian whose incident inspired the entire episode. They band together and go to Washington to lobby the Senate to ban the term N-word guy. The Senate passes the measure because the senators don't want to be called that themselves. Anyone who says the slur and the word guy in a single sentence with fewer than 7 words between them can be prosecuted and fined. Meanwhile, the Cartman versus Dr. Nelson subplot reaches its climax. Dr. Nelson, a black belt in karate, decides he's going to physically fight Cartman to prove that words shouldn't hurt. But Cartman easily overpowers him, and Dr. Nelson ends up humiliated. He storms off claiming he proved his point, but none of the students understood what the point was supposed to be. The physical confrontation proved nothing. Words still hurt, sensitivity training still failed, and Cartman is still laughing. The final scene is where the episode delivers its real message. Stan has been trying the entire episode to make things right with Tolkien. He's apologized, he's pointed to his dad's public contrition, he's tried everything he can think of. And it hasn't worked because Stan keeps approaching the situation from the wrong angle. He keeps trying to explain why it's not a big deal, or why it should be fine now, or why Tolkien shouldn't be upset anymore. Finally, Stan has a realization. He tells Tolkien that he doesn't get it. He says he will never understand how it feels to have that word used against him because he is not black. That admission of ignorance, that acknowledgement that some experiences cannot be fully understood from the outside, that was what Tolkien wanted to hear all along. Not an apology, not an explanation, not a performance of allyship. Just the honest admission that Stan cannot fully understand what Tolkien experiences, and that's okay. You don't have to fully understand someone's pain to respect it. Now here's what's really remarkable about this episode. It aired with the slur used 42 times, completely uncensored. You'd think that would have caused a firestorm, but the reaction was almost the opposite. The NAACP actually praised the episode, calling it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words and their impact on individuals. IGN gave it a perfect 10 out of 10 score. The Parents Television Council predictably condemned it, but no major protests or boycotts materialized. The reason is that the episode wasn't using the word for shock value. It was dissecting why the word has power, and why white discomfort doesn't entitle anyone to forgiveness. Academic papers have been written about this episode, including a formal analysis published in the academic journal A Spears examining how the episode portrays white anxiety around racial accountability. The thing that really gets me about With Apologies to Jesse Jackson is how accurately it predicted the way racial discourse would evolve over the next 2 decades. The cycle of offense, public apology, and expected forgiveness that the episode satirizes has become the dominant pattern of racial controversy in American culture. A public figure says something racist, they issue a carefully worded apology, they appear on the right talk shows, and they expect the incident to be resolved. Tolkien's frustration with this cycle in 2007 was ahead of its time. The idea that affected communities are not obligated to accept apologies just because they were publicly performed didn't become a mainstream conversation until years later. Parker and Stone, guided by Vernon Chapman's real anger about the situation, accidentally created one of the most prescient commentaries on race that American television has produced. But the episode also does something that a lot of racial commentary refuses to do. It acknowledges that most white people who say offensive things aren't doing it out of genuine hatred. Randy isn't a white supremacist, he's an idiot who panicked on a game show. The episode doesn't excuse his behavior, but it also doesn't pretend he's the same as someone who uses racial slurs with malicious intent. That distinction matters because it makes the episode's message more effective. If Randy were simply a villain, the audience could distance themselves from him. But because Randy is a normal, flawed, somewhat stupid person who made a terrible mistake, the audience has to confront the possibility that they could make the same mistake. And that discomfort is where the real education happens. The Cartman subplot reinforces this by showing the other end of the spectrum. Cartman is deliberately cruel. He laughs at Dr. Nelson not because he panicked or made a mistake, but because he genuinely finds other people's differences hilarious. No amount of sensitivity training will fix Cartman because his cruelty isn't accidental. It's who he is. The episode puts Randy and Cartman side by side and asks the audience to consider the difference between ignorance and malice, between a mistake and a character flaw. Both cause harm, both need to be addressed, but they require completely different responses. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson aired almost 2 decades ago, and it still holds up as one of the most honest examinations of racial language in American popular culture. It doesn't tell you what to think, it doesn't moralize, it doesn't provide easy answers. It just shows you the mess and lets you sit in it. And somehow, despite using the most offensive word in the English language 42 times, It does this with more nuance and intelligence than most serious dramas could manage. That's the power of South Park at its best. It uses the most offensive possible framing to deliver insights that polite conversation could never reach. But the Jesse Jackson episode wasn't the first time South Park tackled race head-on. 7 years earlier, they did something even more provocative. They put a literal lynching on the town flag and then asked whether keeping it was racist. And the answer they came up with is still making people argue 2 decades later. Chef Goes Nanners is the episode where South Park decided to take on the Confederate flag debate by inventing a town flag so outrageously racist that nobody could possibly defend keeping it. And then half the town defends keeping it. The episode aired on July 5, 2000 during season 4. It was the 55th episode overall, and according to the DVD commentary, it was directly inspired by the real controversy over whether the Confederate flag should be removed from the South Carolina State House. That debate had been raging through the late 90s, with one side arguing the flag was a symbol of heritage and history, and the other side pointing out that it was also the battle flag of people who fought a war to keep slavery legal. Parker and Stone watched this debate and thought the most interesting thing about it was how both sides seemed completely unable to understand what the other side was actually saying. So they created the South Park town flag. And it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. The flag depicts 4 white stick figures standing around a gallows, cheering, while a black stick figure hangs from the noose. That's the official flag of South Park, Colorado. It's been the town flag since the town was founded. And the episode opens with Chef, the school cook, and one of the only black residents in town, finally noticing this and completely losing his mind about it. Chef storms into the mayor's office and demands the flag be changed. Jimbo, the town's gun-obsessed uncle figure, argues that the flag has been around since the founding of the town and represents their history. He doesn't want to change it because it's tradition, not because he supports what it depicts. The mayor unfurls the flag in her office, looks at it, and you can see even she's uncomfortable with what she's looking at. But she doesn't want to make a decision that will upset half the town. This is the first layer of the satire. The people defending the flag aren't racists in the traditional sense. They're just people who don't want to deal with change and have convinced themselves that historical tradition is more important than what the symbol actually represents. Chef immediately starts rallying support to change the flag, but he runs into a problem that perfectly mirrors the real Confederate flag debate. Most of the townspeople don't have strong opinions either way. They can see why the flag is racist, sure, but they can also see why it represents history. They're the vast majority of people in any controversial debate, the ones who kind of see both sides and would rather not get involved. Chef can't build a movement because most people are too apathetic to care about something that doesn't directly affect them. At school, the kids are assigned to debate the flag issue. Stan and Kyle lead the team arguing to keep the flag the same. Wendy and Cartman lead the team arguing to change it. Now, Cartman only joins Wendy's side because he knows it will irritate her, which is classic Cartman behavior. He doesn't care about the flag one way or the other. He just wants to make Wendy's life miserable. During their research sessions, Cartman ignores the actual issue entirely, and instead develops a strategy based on digging up dirt on Stan and Kyle to win the debate through personal attacks. He's treating a debate about racism like a political campaign, using ad hominem tactics instead of engaging with the actual substance. Meanwhile, Kyle and Stan are studying constitutional law and free speech arguments at Kyle's dad's law office, taking the assignment seriously. The episode's most clever plot point happens when the KKK shows up. A local branch of the Ku Klux Klan arrives at City Hall to loudly support keeping the flag unchanged. They call it a symbol of white power and celebrate its racist imagery. This creates an immediate crisis for Jimbo and the other flag defenders. They never wanted to be on the same side as the Klan. They were defending the flag based on tradition and history, not racial hatred. But now they're standing shoulder to shoulder with hooded white supremacists, and it's making them deeply uncomfortable. Jimbo and his friend Ned come up with a brilliant solution. They disguise themselves as Klan members, infiltrate a nighttime meeting, and convince the Klan leadership to switch sides. The logic is beautiful in its simplicity. Jimbo explains that everyone hates the Klan. Whatever side the Klan supports is the side that's going to lose. So if the Klan announces they want the flag changed, public opinion will swing toward keeping it. The Klan members, who are portrayed as bumbling idiots who spend most of their meetings holding cake raffles and playing games like Who's Got the Silliest Thing on Under Their Robe, agree to the plan. The whole scene is Parker and Stone doing what they do best, making genuinely horrible people look so pathetic and stupid that they can't be taken seriously as a threat. The KKK in this episode is less a terrifying hate group and more a sad social club for losers who have nothing else going on in their lives. But there's a complication. As Jimbo and Ned are sneaking out of the clan meeting, Chef happens to be driving by and sees them in their clan robes. He doesn't hear their conversation or understand their plan. All he sees is two of his friends dressed in white hoods at a clan rally. Chef, who has already been calling the entire town racists and slinging the word cracker around freely, takes this as final confirmation that everyone in South Park is against him. The mayor tries to appease Chef by modifying the flag so that the black stick figure being hanged now appears to be smiling. This is one of those South Park moments that's so absurd it hurts. The town's solution to a racist flag is to make the lynching victim look happy about being lynched. Chef is understandably furious about this compromise and storms out again. The mayor, tired of dealing with the whole situation, decides to let the kids' debate club make the final decision about the flag. This puts enormous pressure on the debate. And here's where the B plot kicks in, because while all this racial tension is building, Wendy starts developing an unexpected attraction to Cartman. They've been spending time together preparing their debate arguments, and something weird is happening between them. Wendy is horrified by her own feelings because Cartman is everything she despises. She confides in her friend Bibe, who explains that it's just sexual tension and that the best way to get rid of it is to kiss Cartman and get it out of her system. During the actual debate, Wendy is so distracted by her feelings for Cartman that she can't deliver her opening remarks. She walks across the stage and kisses Cartman in front of the entire town. Stan is completely shocked, but once the tension is broken, Wendy is able to continue with her argument about why the flag should be changed, arguing that society needs to evolve past symbols that represent violence against people. Then it's Stan and Kyle's turn to present their case. And this is where the episode drops its real bombshell. Kyle gives their side of the argument, talking about how killing is a natural part of life and isn't necessarily a big deal. He's making an argument about capital punishment. When Chef stands up and demands they address the racist aspect of the flag, something remarkable happens. Stan and Kyle are completely confused. They look at each other and then at the flag, and it becomes clear that they never noticed the racial component at all. They just saw 5 stick figures, one of whom was being hanged. They thought the debate was about whether capital punishment should be represented on a town flag. The fact that the hanged figure was black and the others were white never registered with them. They didn't make the distinction because to them it wasn't a distinction worth making. They saw people, not races. Chef is genuinely moved by this. He realizes that the children were so not racist that they didn't even separate the figures by skin color. All they saw was 5 people. For Chef, this is a beautiful sentiment about childhood innocence and the idea that racism is taught, not inherent. But it also forces Chef to confront something about himself. He delivers the episode's moral, admitting that his crusade against the flag almost turned him into a racist. By calling everyone in town a cracker and assuming they were all motivated by racial hatred, he was doing the very thing he accused them of. He was seeing everything through a racial lens, and that lens was creating more division, not less. Perceiving things according to race, he concludes, leads only to further racism. Jimbo also gets his moment of growth. He tells Chef that he genuinely has no problem with black people, and that being on the same side as the KKK made him realize some traditions aren't worth defending when they attract that kind of support. Chef and Jimbo come to a compromise, and the flag is changed. The new flag still shows a stick figure being hanged because apparently the town is really committed to depicting execution on their flag, but now the crowd doing the hanging is multiracial. People of all colors, including another black person, are participating in the hanging while holding hands. It's absurd and it's offensive, and it's somehow presented as the perfect compromise. In the final scene, Wendy tells Cartman she's glad the sexual tension is resolved and that she now feels nothing for him. Cartman laughs it off at first, but as Wendy runs after Stan, Cartman walks away alone, looking genuinely sad. The implication is that he was actually developing real feelings for Wendy, which is one of those rare moments where the show reminds you that even Cartman is human somewhere deep inside that sociopathic exterior. Now, here's where it gets interesting from a modern perspective. The episode's central message that not seeing race is the most not racist thing you can do was considered progressive in 2000. The idea of colorblindness was seen as an aspirational goal. If we could all just stop noticing race, racism would disappear. But over the past 2 decades, that philosophy has come under serious criticism. Modern discourse around race generally argues that not seeing race is itself a form of erasure, that pretending racial differences don't exist ignores the very real systemic inequalities that those differences have created. The argument today is that you need to see race in order to understand and address racial injustice. Matt Stone himself seemed to sense that the episode didn't quite land. In the DVD commentary, he called Chef Goes Nanners kind of half-baked. He felt that neither side is necessarily wrong. Framing didn't achieve what they intended. The episode was supposed to present both sides of the flag debate as having legitimate points, but the flag is so obviously racist that the keep it for history argument doesn't hold up under any scrutiny. It's hard to argue that both sides have a point when one side is defending a picture of a lynching. What makes Chef Goes Nanners still worth analyzing is that it captures a very specific moment in how America talked about race. The early 2000s colorblindness ideal, the Confederate flag debates, the tension between acknowledging racial history and moving past it. These were the conversations happening in living rooms and city halls across the country. South Park didn't resolve those conversations, but it put them on screen in a way that forced people to engage with the absurdity on all sides. Chef's character in this episode is particularly important because Chef, voiced by Isaac Hayes, served as South Park's moral compass on racial issues for the show's first 9 seasons. He was the adult the kids went to when they didn't understand something, and he was frequently the only character who could cut through the town's collective stupidity. Hayes performed the role from the show's premiere in 1997 until his departure in 2006 over the Scientology satire episode Trapped in the Closet. Losing Chef meant losing the show's primary vehicle for addressing race from a Black perspective, which is part of why later racial episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson and The Big Fix had to find different approaches. Chef Goes Nanners tried to find middle ground on racism. It wanted to say that both extreme anti-racism and casual racism are problematic, and that children's colorblindness is the ideal to aspire to. Whether you agree with that message depends a lot on when you're watching it. In 2000, it felt like wisdom. Today, it feels like the starting point of a conversation that has moved well beyond where Parker and Stone left it. But that's also kind of the point. South Park has always been about capturing a moment in time, and this episode captures the year 2000's racial discourse with perfect accuracy, even if that discourse looks incomplete by today's standards. The debate about the South Carolina Confederate flag that inspired Chef Goes Nanners has continued to evolve in the decades since the episode aired. In 2015, 15 years after the episode broadcast, the Confederate flag was finally removed from the South Carolina State House grounds following the massacre of 9 Black parishioners at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston by a white supremacist who had posed with Confederate flags in photographs posted online. The flag's removal was celebrated by many as a long overdue acknowledgement that symbols of racial oppression don't belong in places of governmental authority. Others saw it as an erasure of history, using exactly the same arguments Jimbo and the flag defenders made in the episode. The fact that it took a mass murder to accomplish what Chef was asking for in a cartoon in the year 2000 says something about how slowly American society processes racial symbolism. The episode depicted the debate as essentially deadlocked, with most people too apathetic to care, and the loudest voices on both sides talking past each other. That deadlock was an accurate depiction of where American society stood on Confederate symbols for the first 15 years of the 21st century. The symbols stayed because removing them required more energy than keeping them, and because the people most harmed by them didn't have enough political power to force a change on their own. What's particularly interesting about rewatching Chef Goes Nanners in this context is how the episode's compromise ending, where the flag now shows a multiracial group performing the hanging, feels less like a clever joke and more like a grimly accurate prediction of how America actually handles racial symbols. We don't remove them, we modify them, we add diversity to the existing structure without changing the structure itself. We put a Black man in the mob doing the hanging and call it progress. The episode meant this as absurdist humor, but it accidentally described the template for how institutions would handle demands for racial equity for the next 2 decades. change the faces, keep the system. Chef's departure from the show in 2006 marked the end of an era for South Park's racial commentary. Isaac Hayes voiced the character from the show's premiere through season 9. He left after the episode Trapped in the Closet satirized Scientology, which Hayes practiced. The show addressed his departure in the season 10 premiere, Return of Chef, by having Chef be brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club and then killed off in graphic fashion. The loss of Chef meant the loss of the show's only regularly recurring black adult character, and the racial episodes that followed had to adapt to that absence. Without a black voice in the ensemble, the show's racial commentary shifted from internal dialogue between races to external observation of how white people behave around racial issues. This shift was significant and permanent, and it explains why the later episodes we'll discuss, including the Big Fix and the PC Principle era, are fundamentally different in their approach than the earlier episodes that featured Chef. But 4 years later, South Park tackled immigration in a way that created one of the most quoted lines in the show's entire history. And it's still getting screamed at political rallies to this day. Goobacks might be the most quotable episode South Park has ever produced about race, immigration, and the panic that happens when people feel like outsiders are taking what belongs to them. The episode aired on April 28, 2004, during season 8, and it created a catchphrase so catchy and so perfectly stupid that it escaped the show entirely and became a real thing people say in actual political conversations, which is exactly the kind of cultural impact that makes South Park both brilliant and terrifying. The whole thing starts with the boys trying to make money shoveling snow. They set up shop on a street corner, offering their services for a few bucks per driveway. Standard kid entrepreneur stuff. But when they get to their first potential customer, they discover someone else has already taken the job, not another kid from town. A strange-looking man covered in some kind of translucent goo who barely speaks English and who offered to do the work for 25 cents. The boys are confused and annoyed. Who is this guy, and why is he willing to work for almost nothing? Turns out he's from the future, the year 3045 specifically. A time portal has opened up, and people from 1,000 years in the future are traveling back to the present because conditions in their time are so terrible that even minimum wage work in 2004 is enough to feed their families. The time portal follows what the show calls Terminator rules, meaning it's one way only. The show takes a moment to explain this by also mentioning Back to the Future rules, which are two-way, and Time Rider rules, which are just plain silly. That little joke is Parker and Stone reminding you that they're pop culture nerds before they're political commentators. CNN covers the story, and the news anchors explain what these future people look like. They're a hairless, uniform mix of all races. Their skin is a single blended color because after 1,000 years of interracial mixing, distinct racial categories no longer exist. Their language is a guttural combination of every world language. They look the same, they sound the same, and they're willing to work for almost nothing. The show is setting up the most obvious immigration allegory possible, but it's doing it through science fiction so it can be way more explicit than a straightforward immigration episode would allow. The time immigrants keep coming. At first it's just one or two, but soon dozens are pouring through the portal every day, bringing wives and children. They start taking jobs across South Park, not just snow shoveling, but construction, fast food, cleaning, all the manual labor positions that form the backbone of working class employment. And they'll do it for a fraction of what local workers expect to be paid. The local economy starts to buckle. This triggers a town hall meeting that perfectly captures the structure of every anti-immigration rally in American history. Construction worker Daryl Weathers stands at the podium and delivers the immortal line, "They took our jobs," the crowd agrees. "They took our jobs," they repeat it. "They took our gerbs," and then it keeps degrading. Each time someone says it, the words get more mangled and less coherent. "They took our gerbs, Durker derbs, Durka dur." By the end, the protest chant has devolved into completely unintelligible grunting, which is Parker and Stone's way of saying that anti-immigrant rhetoric sounds like nonsense when you actually listen to what people are saying. The genius of "they took our jobs" as a catchphrase is that it works on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's mocking the working class men who feel threatened by immigration. Their legitimate economic concerns are expressed in increasingly inarticulate ways, making them look foolish. But the episode is also acknowledging that their concerns are real. Jobs are being taken, wages are being undercut. Working families are struggling. The men in the room aren't wrong about the facts. They're wrong about the response, and they're wrong about who to blame. The future immigrants aren't malicious. They're just desperate people from a terrible situation trying to survive. Sound familiar? The show puts this debate on cable news through its parody of the O'Reilly factor. On one side is Daryl Weathers, labeled on screen as pissed-off white trash redneck conservative. On the other side is a hippie, labeled aging hippie liberal douche. The hippie tells Weathers that his ancestors were immigrants too and that he has no right to turn these people away. Weathers responds with the only argument he has: "De Turk Gerbs." Rednecks in the studio audience back him up with their own garbled versions of the chant. The show isn't taking a side, it's saying both sides of the immigration debate as presented on cable news are equally useless. One side reduces a complex economic issue to xenophobic grunting. The other side reduces it to sanctimonious moralizing. Neither side is actually proposing solutions. Things escalate when the boys go to a fast food restaurant staffed entirely by future immigrants. The cashier can barely understand Stan's order. "Chicken sandwich." The manager, who is supposedly the best English speaker in the restaurant, can't help either. Stan loses it and screams, "I want a goddamn cheeseburger and some goddamn fries, you fucking Goobacks." His parents happen to walk in at exactly that moment and are horrified. They ground Stan for being time-sist. The word Goobacks is a slur referring to the goo that covers the time travelers' bodies as a side effect of the portal, and using it is treated the same way any racial slur would be treated. This is one of the most effective satirical tools in the episode. By inventing a new form of discrimination called Timesism, the show strips away the specific historical baggage of real-world racism and forces you to look at the structure of bigotry itself. The arguments against the Goobacks are identical to arguments against real-world immigrants. They don't speak our language. They're taking our jobs. They're changing our culture. They refuse to assimilate. Stan's parents are angry at him for using a slur, but they've also hired a Gooback housekeeper for 10 cents an hour, which means they're benefiting from the exact system they're condemning their son for criticizing. The hypocrisy is baked into every level of the situation. Randy's journey through the episode mirrors what happens to many middle-class Americans when immigration becomes personal. At first, he's the reasonable voice telling Stan that the immigrants are just taking menial jobs nobody else wants and that it's wrong to judge them. Then, a future immigrant with geology expertise shows up at his office and takes Randy's job for less money. Suddenly, Randy's at the protest rally, just as angry as everyone else. His principles evaporate the instant the issue affects his paycheck. That transformation from tolerant liberal to angry protester happens in about 30 seconds of screen time, which is brutally efficient storytelling. The protest movement comes up with increasingly desperate solutions. First, they suggest shooting everyone who crosses the time border. A congressman tells them this is inhumane. Then Daryl Weathers proposes the most absurd plan possible. The men should all get into a giant pile and have sex with each other. The logic, such as it is, goes like this. If they all become gay, they won't reproduce. If they don't reproduce, the future people who are their descendants won't exist. Therefore, no more immigration. The men initially resist the idea, but Weathers talks them into it. And soon there's a massive pile of naked men writhing around in front of the immigrant section of town called Little Future. The giant gay pile is one of the most deliberately shocking images South Park has ever created, and it serves a very specific satirical purpose. The men who are most vocally opposed to immigration, who present themselves as tough, masculine, working-class defenders of traditional values, are willing to participate in a mass public sex act rather than adapt to changing economic conditions. The show is saying that the anti-immigration movement would literally rather do the most extreme, self-destructive thing imaginable than consider the possibility that their worldview needs to change. Stan, watching all of this unfold, eventually gets a chance to speak at the protest. The CNN cameras are on him, and he delivers the episode's most genuine insight. He says it's wrong to call the immigrants Goobacks because they're no different from us. He acknowledges that the future people come from poverty and are just trying to survive. But he also recognizes that poor societies sometimes hurt the societies they enter, even unintentionally. His solution is that instead of blaming the immigrants, the people of the present should try to make the future better so the immigrants won't need to come in the first place. It's a genuinely thoughtful position. Address the root cause instead of punishing the symptom. The townspeople are moved by Stan's speech. They start doing exactly what he suggested. They plant trees, recycle, give to the poor, use cleaner energy. An uplifting environmental song plays as the community comes together to build a better future. The time immigrants start to fade away as the future improves. It's working. The solution is actually working. And then Stan stops. He looks around at everyone planting trees and picking up litter and says, "This is gay." Kyle agrees. "This is really gay." Cartman declares that it's gayer than when the men were all in the pile having sex. Stan sighs and says, "Everyone back in the pile." And all the men rush back to the gay pile while the last straggler screams the now completely unintelligible "Derka Dur." That ending is one of the most perfectly constructed jokes in South Park history. The show gives you the actual solution to the immigration problem. Make the world better so desperate people don't need to leave their homes. It's the obvious answer, it's the right answer, and it's immediately rejected because it requires sustained effort, communal sacrifice, and looking uncool while doing it. Americans would rather participate in a bizarre public orgy than commit to long-term environmental and social improvement. The joke isn't that the solution is wrong. The joke is that we know what the solution is and we refuse to do it because it's hard and boring and doesn't feel like winning. The cultural impact of Goobacks can't be overstated. "They took our jobs" became one of the most recognizable catchphrases in South Park history. It's been quoted in actual congressional hearings. It shows up at real immigration rallies. People use it both sincerely and ironically, which means it succeeded as satire in the most complete way possible. It gave both sides of the immigration debate a phrase they could use, and both sides think the phrase supports their position. Anti-immigration commentators quote it to mock the idea that their concerns are illegitimate. Pro-immigration commentators quote it to mock the inarticulate nature of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Parker and Stone created a perfect satirical weapon that cuts in every direction simultaneously. The episode also predicted several developments in immigration discourse that wouldn't become mainstream for years. The concept of Timesism presaged the modern understanding that discrimination doesn't require traditional racial categories. You can be prejudiced against anyone who looks different, talks different, or comes from somewhere else, even if that somewhere else is a different time period. The economic anxiety subplot, where legitimate concerns about job displacement get co-opted by xenophobic movements, has played out in real elections across the Western world in the 2 decades since this episode aired. What makes Goobacks work as both comedy and commentary is that it refuses to provide a comfortable position for the viewer. If you sympathize with the workers losing their jobs, you're on the same side as the men in the gay pile. If you sympathize with the immigrants, you're ignoring the real economic damage their arrival causes. If you agree with Stan's environmental solution, you're doing something the show itself calls gay. Every possible reaction is mocked, which means the only honest response is to admit that the issue is genuinely complicated and that simple answers are always going to be inadequate. Goobacks used science fiction to talk about immigration. But before we move on, I want to dig into something about Goobacks that most analyses of the episode miss. The episode is doing something technically innovative with how it structures its racial commentary. Most shows that tackle immigration either sympathize primarily with the immigrants or primarily with the native population. They take a side and then build their story around defending that side's perspective. Goobacks refuses to do this, and it refuses in a very specific way that reveals something important about how Parker and Stone think about social issues in general. The trick is in the framing of each scene. When you're watching the scenes from the workers' perspective, their economic anxiety feels genuine and legitimate. When Daryl Weather stands at that podium and talks about how hard he worked to get his pay to a level where he can support his family, and how the time immigrants are going to undercut all of that, you can feel the frustration. These are people who followed the rules, put in the hours, built careers based on the expectation that their skills would be valued, and now someone is willing to do their job for a fraction of the cost. That's a real problem. That's a real betrayal of the social contract. And the show gives you enough time in those scenes to feel what those workers feel before pulling back and showing you how absurd their response is. Then when you're watching the scenes from the immigrant's perspective, their desperation feels equally genuine. These are people from a future so terrible that traveling 1,000 years into the past to wash dishes for pennies is a step up. They didn't choose to disrupt the local economy, they're just trying to survive. When the newscast explains that the money one immigrant earns in a day is enough to feed his family back in 3045, the show is making the same point that immigrant advocates have been making for decades. Nobody leaves everything they know and travels to a strange place unless the alternative is worse. The immigrants aren't villains. They're victims of circumstances so extreme that the present day looks like paradise by comparison. What makes this structurally innovative is that the show commits fully to both perspectives without resolving the tension between them. Most immigration narratives eventually pick a winner. Either the immigrants are clearly the heroes and anyone who opposes them is clearly a villain, or the native population has legitimate concerns that the immigrants are threatening. Goobacks presents both as simultaneously true. The workers are right that their livelihoods are being destroyed. The immigrants are right that they have no choice. And neither side can solve the problem without addressing the other side's concerns. The episode's solution, where everyone starts planting trees and being environmentally conscious until they decide it's boring and go back to the gay pile, is funny because it acknowledges that the actual solution exists, but requires more effort and cooperation than anyone is willing to invest. This structural approach is something South Park brings to almost all of its racial episodes. The show isn't interested in identifying heroes and villains. It's interested in identifying the systems that create conflict and the human weaknesses that prevent those conflicts from being resolved. In Chef Goes Nanners, the system is a town that kept a racist flag for generations without anyone questioning it. In With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, the system is an apology culture that prioritizes the comfort of the offender over the experience of the offended. In Goobacks, the system is an economic structure that puts workers and immigrants in direct competition for resources that the actual owners of capital, who never appear in the episode, control from above. The fact that the capitalist class is completely absent from Goobacks is itself a form of commentary. Nobody in the episode asks who benefits from cheap immigrant labor. Nobody points out that the same businesses complaining about wages were happy to hire time immigrants at exploitative rates. The workers blame the immigrants just want to survive. And the people who actually profit from the entire arrangement are nowhere to be seen. Parker and Stone might not be Marxists, but this episode accidentally produces one of the most structurally accurate depictions of how capital uses immigration to divide the working class that has ever appeared on American television. There's also something worth noting about the way the episode handles the physical appearance of the time immigrants. They're described as a uniform blend of all races, hairless, with a single skin color that represents the eventual merging of all human racial categories. This is actually a pretty optimistic vision of the future in one sense. In 1,000 years, racial distinctions as we know them will have disappeared through intermarriage and genetic blending. But the episode uses this post-racial future to make a present-day point. Even when the immigrants are literally beyond race, when they can't be categorized into any existing racial group, the people of South Park still find reasons to discriminate against them. They coin a new slur. They develop new prejudices. They create a new form of bigotry from scratch because the impulse to otherize newcomers doesn't require racial categories to function. It just requires an us and a them. This insight anticipates a lot of modern sociological research about how prejudice adapts to changing demographics. Researchers have documented that when traditional racial categories become less distinct, through intermarriage and cultural blending, new forms of discrimination emerge based on accent, religion, national origin, or economic class. The human tendency to sort people into in-groups and out-groups doesn't go away when race becomes less salient. It just finds new criteria. Goobacks depicted this adaptation in 2004, years before it became a significant topic in academic research. The lasting cultural impact of the episode extends beyond just the catchphrase. "They took our jobs" has been referenced in congressional floor speeches, cited in academic papers about immigration rhetoric, used in protest signs at immigration rallies on both sides, and parodied in other television shows. It became shorthand for a particular kind of economic anxiety that is real, but often expressed in ways that are counterproductive and sometimes racist. When someone references the phrase, they're invoking an entire worldview about immigration, economic competition, and the relationship between identity and livelihood. That a cartoon catchphrase carries this much political weight says something about how American culture processes complex issues. We turn them into memes, we turn them into catchphrases. We reduce decades of economic research and centuries of immigration history to 4 words that sound progressively less coherent each time they're repeated. And maybe that reduction is the most honest commentary of all. Now, 5 years before Goobacks, South Park did something even more audacious. They accused an entire country of using a children's toy craze as a front for a military attack on the United States. And somehow, the episode was right about how cultural panic actually works. Chinpokomon is the episode where South Park turned the entire Pokemon craze of the late 90s into a Japanese military plot to brainwash American children into bombing Pearl Harbor. It aired on November 3, 1999 during Season 3, and it manages to be simultaneously one of the most racially provocative episodes the show has ever done, and one of the most accurate commentaries on consumer culture they've ever produced. The fact that it does both of these things at the same time using cartoon characters shaped like testicles is honestly impressive. So here's the context. In 1999, Pokemon was the single biggest cultural phenomenon in the world. Kids were obsessed with it. They were watching the show, playing the video games, collecting the cards, buying the toys. Parents were standing in line for hours to get their kids Pokemon merchandise for Christmas. The franchise generated billions of dollars in revenue and completely dominated the attention of an entire generation of children. Parker and Stone, being the kind of people who instinctively distrust anything that's popular, looked at the Pokemon craze and saw something unsettling underneath the cute monsters and catchy theme songs. They saw a foreign corporation that had figured out exactly how to manipulate American children's brains, and they saw American parents who were completely powerless to stop it. The episode opens with the boys discovering Chinpokomon, a new Japanese toy and entertainment franchise that's sweeping the country. Everything about Chinpokomon is a dead-on parody of Pokemon. The creatures have ridiculous names, the TV show is epileptic, seizure-inducing, and the toys are deliberately designed to be collected compulsively. The kids are immediately hooked. They need to buy every Chinpokomon. They need to watch every episode. They need to get the video game. The marketing machine has them completely locked in, and nothing their parents say can break the spell. But here's where the show goes from cultural parody into racial satire. The Chinpokomon Corporation isn't just selling toys, they're using the children's toy craze as cover for a literal military operation. The TV show contains subliminal messages training kids to hate the American government. The toys are propaganda tools, and the Chinpokomon camp that the kids attend isn't a fan convention. It's a military training facility where the Japanese instructors teach American children that the evil power they must destroy is the United States government, and that they will begin by bombing Pearl Harbor. The kids start learning Japanese, marching in formation, and preparing for an actual attack on American soil. This is obviously absurd. It's a cartoon about 8-year-olds being recruited by toy manufacturers to reenact the attack on Pearl Harbor. But underneath the absurdity, there's a real fear being satirized here. The late 90s saw a significant wave of anxiety about Japanese cultural influence in America. Pokemon was the most visible symbol of this, but it was part of a larger pattern. Japanese video games, anime, manga, and consumer electronics were becoming dominant forces in American culture. And there was a segment of the American public that was genuinely uncomfortable with how much influence Japanese companies had over their children's minds. This wasn't new anxiety either. It was a modern version of the yellow peril fears that had existed in American culture since the 19th century. The idea that Asian cultures were somehow infiltrating and undermining Western civilization from within. Parker and Stone take this anxiety and push it to its most ridiculous extreme. In their version, the Japanese conspiracy is real. The toy companies are actually trying to brainwash American children. But the episode's real target isn't Japan. It's America, because the show makes it very clear that the Japanese plan works not because the Japanese are diabolically clever, but because Americans are incredibly easy to manipulate. This brings us to the episode's most controversial and funniest running gag. Every time an American adult tries to confront the Chinpokomon executives about what they're doing, The Japanese businessmen deflect the conversation using what the show calls the large American penis trick. They start complimenting the American man on the size of his genitalia. They express amazement and envy at how large and impressive it is compared to their own, which they describe as tiny and embarrassing. The American men, flattered beyond reason, immediately forget what they were angry about and leave feeling great about themselves. This works on every single man in the episode. The shop owner who goes to Japan to investigate, the parents who confront the Chinpokomon creators at a town meeting, even President Clinton, who takes a call about the Pearl Harbor attack and gets completely sidetracked by the penis compliments. The women in the show can see through the trick immediately. Sharon Marsh and the other mothers try to tell their husbands that they're being manipulated, but the men are too busy feeling validated to listen. This is Parker and Stone making a point about how American masculinity creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. American men are so insecure about their virility and status that simple flattery can override their judgment completely. The Japanese executives in the episode aren't evil geniuses. They're just good at identifying and exploiting American insecurity. Now, is this bit racially problematic? Absolutely. It trades on stereotypes about Asian male anatomy. It depicts the Japanese characters as sneaky and manipulative, and it presents Japanese culture as fundamentally oriented toward deception. These are all real stereotypes that have been used to justify real discrimination against Asian people. But the episode is also, in a roundabout way, criticizing those stereotypes by making them the tool through which Americans are manipulated. The Americans in the episode believe the stereotypes, and that belief is what makes them vulnerable. The Japanese businessmen know that Americans hold these stereotypes and deliberately play into them as a strategy. The real stupidity in the episode belongs to the Americans who are so invested in their own cultural superiority that they can't see they're being played. The kids, meanwhile, are fully indoctrinated. They march through the streets of South Park toward an airfield where real fighter planes are waiting. They've been so thoroughly brainwashed by the Chinpokomon marketing machine that they're actually going to attempt to bomb Pearl Harbor. The adults are panicking. Nothing they've tried has worked. The penis trick neutralized every confrontation. Their attempts to interest the kids in alternative fads, including hilariously bad commercials for products like Wild Wacky Action Bike, that doesn't do anything, and Alabama Man, a toy that gets drunk and hits his wife, fail completely. It's Sharon who finally figures out the solution. She realizes that kids are inherently fickle about trends. They like things because those things are cool, and things stop being cool the moment adults start liking them. So Sharon organizes all the parents to pretend they love Chinpokomon. They show up at the airfield wearing Chinpokomon merchandise, talking enthusiastically about how great the toys are and how they want to collect them all. The kids, seeing their parents acting like fans, immediately decide Chinpokomon is lame and abandon the entire thing. Kyle is the last holdout, but even he eventually gives up when Stan points out that following a fad just because everyone else is doing it is no better than quitting a fad for the same reason. Kenny dies from a seizure when a nest of rats bursts out of his stomach, which has nothing to do with the plot but is very much in keeping with the show's tradition of killing Kenny in random ways. The resolution is both satisfying and deeply cynical. The military attack is averted not because anyone addressed the underlying manipulation or because American culture developed a meaningful defense against foreign corporate influence. It's averted because kids get bored easily. The entire national security crisis was resolved by the attention span of 8-year-olds. This is Parker and Stone saying that America's greatest vulnerability and its greatest defense are the same thing. Consumerism. Americans are easily seduced by new products, but they also discard those products just as easily. The churn of consumer culture is both the disease and the cure. What makes Chinpokomon important in the context of South Park's racial episodes is how it handles Asian stereotypes. The show doesn't avoid the stereotypes, it deploys them loudly and obviously, but it deploys them in a way that implicates the people who believe them more than the people they're about. The Japanese characters are stereotypical, but they're also the smartest people in the episode. They understand American psychology better than Americans understand themselves. They know exactly which buttons to push and exactly how to exploit American narcissism. If anything, the episode's version of the Japanese is more competent and strategic than the stereotype usually allows. The real idiots in the episode are the Americans, the men who can't resist flattery. the parents who can't control their children, the president who gets sidetracked during a national security briefing by compliments about his genitals, the shop owner who goes to Japan to investigate and comes back convinced everything is fine. Chinpokomon is a story about American stupidity presented in the framework of Japanese stereotypes, and that framing makes it possible to say things about American culture that would be harder to say in a more straightforward setting. The episode also does something interesting with the kids' relationship to the fad. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny don't adopt Chinpokomon because they're stupid. They adopt it because the marketing is genuinely effective and because peer pressure is a powerful force. The show doesn't blame children for being susceptible to manipulation. It blames the adults who created the conditions for that manipulation to succeed. The parents ignored the problem until it was almost too late. The government was too easily distracted to respond. The media covered the controversy without providing any useful information. Every institution that was supposed to protect children failed, and the children themselves had to be tricked into saving themselves. Chinpokomon aired in 1999, and it predicted the template for every moral panic about foreign media influence that would follow. The anxiety about Japanese anime and video games in the late 90s was the same anxiety that would later attach to Korean pop music, Chinese-owned social media apps, and really any cultural product that originates outside the United States and achieves massive popularity with American youth. The structure is always the same. A foreign thing becomes popular. Adults panic about brainwashing. Politicians call for bans or regulations. And eventually the trend either fades naturally or gets absorbed into mainstream culture until it's no longer threatening. The racial dimension of these panics is always present but rarely acknowledged. Americans don't panic about British or Australian cultural imports the same way they panic about Asian ones. The fear of foreign influence is always filtered through existing racial anxieties, and Chinpokomon makes that filter visible by turning it into an actual plot device. The Japanese plan works because Americans already believe certain things about Japanese culture, and the Japanese executives exploit those existing beliefs. It's a closed loop of stereotypes feeding manipulation, feeding more stereotypes. There's also a meta layer to Chinpokomon that's worth noting. South Park itself is a product of the same consumer culture that the episode is satirizing. Kids watch the show, buy the merchandise, play the video games, and absorb the attitudes presented on screen. Parker and Stone are doing with American children exactly what the Chinpokomon creators are doing with the kids in the episode. They're using entertainment to shape how a generation thinks about the world. The only difference is that South Park's subliminal message isn't bomb Pearl Harbor. It's question everything, including this show. But the mechanism of influence is identical. A product gets popular, kids absorb it, parents worry about it, and the culture shifts in ways that nobody fully controls. The racial stereotypes in Chinpokomon have also aged in interesting ways. In 1999, the episode's depiction of Japanese businessmen as sneaky manipulators with small genitalia was read primarily as satire of American stereotypes, rather than as an endorsement of them. Today, with increased awareness of anti-Asian racism and the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans, the same jokes carry a different weight. Parker and Stone might argue that the episode's real target was always American gullibility rather than Japanese culture. But the Asian characters in the episode are still drawn from a stereotype playbook that has been used to justify real discrimination against real people. Whether the satirical intent outweighs the potential for harm is a question that doesn't have a single answer and probably depends on who's watching and what they bring to the viewing experience. The uncomfortable truth about racial satire is that it only works as intended when the audience shares the creator's perspective on what's being mocked. When the audience doesn't share that perspective, satire becomes ammunition. Chinpokomon was designed to mock American paranoia about foreign influence. But for viewers who genuinely fear Asian cultural dominance, the episode can look like confirmation rather than critique. This dual readability is something South Park deals with constantly and is never fully resolved. The show trusts its audience to get the joke, but some members of that audience are getting a different joke than the one that was intended. If you're enjoying this deep dive, subscribe to our channel for more. Now let's talk about the episode where Cartman created a Mexican stereotype so offensive that it accidentally launched a music career. Fat Butt and Pancake Head is the episode where Eric Cartman turned his hand into a racist caricature of Jennifer Lopez, and the caricature became more successful than the real Jennifer Lopez. The episode aired on April 16, 2003 during Season 7, and it's one of those South Park episodes that operates on so many levels simultaneously that you're not sure whether to laugh, cringe, or take notes. It starts as a crude ethnic stereotype gag and ends up being a genuinely insightful commentary on how the entertainment industry packages and sells racial identity as a commodity. The setup is beautifully simple. South Park Elementary is holding a Cultural Diversity Day, which is already a phrase that makes you brace for impact when Cartman is involved. Kyle, being Kyle, takes the assignment seriously. He spends weeks researching and preparing a thoughtful presentation on the role of Latinos in American technology. He puts in real work, he cites sources, he makes a genuine effort to highlight the contributions of Latino Americans to the technology sector. The panel of Latino community leaders who are judging the presentations seems genuinely pleased with Kyle's report. It's the kind of school assignment that actually achieves its stated purpose of educating students about cultural diversity. Then Cartman goes up. And Cartman being Cartman, his presentation is the exact opposite of what the assignment intended. He announces that he's going to present on the effects of Latino culture on the arts in America, and he claims to have a special guest, Jennifer Lopez. But instead of the real Jennifer Lopez, Cartman has drawn a face on his hand and is performing a crude ventriloquist act. His Ms. Lopez speaks in a heavily exaggerated Mexican accent, talks exclusively about tacos and burritos, and can't even pronounce the J in her own first name, much to Cartman's visible frustration with his own hand puppet. Now here's the thing that everyone notices. Jennifer Lopez is Puerto Rican, not Mexican. The fact that Cartman's stereotype centers around tacos and burritos, which are Mexican foods, reveals that Cartman doesn't know or care about the distinction between different Latino cultures. To Cartman, all Latino identity is interchangeable. Puerto Rican, Mexican, Colombian, it's all the same to him. He reduces an entire hemisphere of diverse cultures and nationalities down to a hand puppet that talks about fast food. And the show knows this is exactly what American popular culture does all the time. The mainstream entertainment industry frequently treats Latino identity as a monolith, ignoring the enormous cultural, linguistic, and national differences within the Latino community. But here's where the episode gets really uncomfortable. Despite the blatantly offensive nature of Cartman's presentation, despite the fact that it's clearly racist, lazy, and inaccurate, the panel of Latino judges awards Cartman first place. He wins a $20 gift certificate to the mall. Kyle, who spent weeks doing genuine cultural research, loses to a hand puppet doing ethnic stereotypes. Kyle is furious, and honestly, the audience should be too. But the judge's decision is the episode making a point that's hard to argue with. In American culture, crude stereotypes are often more commercially successful than genuine cultural engagement. People respond to familiar caricatures more enthusiastically than they respond to nuanced representation. Cartman's hand puppet won because it gave the audience what it expected, even though what it expected was racist garbage. This is where the episode starts escalating in ways that nobody could have predicted from the opening setup. Cartman uses his $20 prize to take Ms. Lopez to the mall, where he records a music video. The puppet sings about taco-flavored kisses and her love for burritos, and the video goes viral. People love it, not despite the fact that it's a racist stereotype, but because of it. The music industry picks up on it, record labels are interested. Ms. Lopez, a racist hand puppet operated by a sociopathic 10-year-old, is becoming a legitimate pop star. Meanwhile, Cartman insists to everyone that his hand puppet has a mind of its own. He claims he can't control what Ms. Lopez says or does. Kyle and the other boys don't buy it. They think Cartman is just doing his usual thing, creating an outrageous situation and then denying responsibility for it. But Cartman sticks to his story with the kind of absolute commitment that makes him such an effective manipulator. He's creating plausible deniability for his racism. By claiming the hand puppet is autonomous, he can say the most offensive things imaginable, and then shrug and say, it wasn't him, it was Ms. Lopez. She has her own personality. He can't control her. This is basically the same defense that every public figure uses when they get caught saying something racist. It was taken out of context. That's not what I meant. The words were mine, but the sentiment wasn't. The episode then introduces its most absurd subplot. Ben Affleck, who at the time was dating the real Jennifer Lopez in one of the most tabloid-covered relationships of the early 2000s, sees Cartman's hand puppet on television and falls in love with it. Not in a joking way. Affleck genuinely believes that Cartman's hand is the real Jennifer Lopez, and he begins a romantic relationship with it. He takes the hand on dates, he buys it gifts. He's completely smitten. Cartman is horrified because Affleck keeps trying to make out with his hand, which means Affleck is essentially making out with Cartman. The whole situation creates this nightmarish scenario where Cartman is trapped in a relationship he didn't want because his racist puppet was too convincing. The real Jennifer Lopez eventually finds out about the imposter and shows up in South Park to confront her. This leads to a scene where the actual Jennifer Lopez is arguing with a racist caricature of herself drawn on a 10-year-old's hand. The real J-Lo is furious, but the puppet J-Lo fights back with more stereotypical insults and cultural reductions. It's a confrontation between a real person and a racist image of that person. And the racist image refuses to back down because it has an audience that loves it. This is the episode's central thesis, and it's actually quite dark when you think about it. The entertainment industry doesn't just tolerate racial stereotypes, it actively rewards them. The most commercially successful version of Latino identity in this episode isn't Kyle's thoughtful presentation about technology contributions. It's a hand puppet saying taco-flavored kisses in a bad accent. The hand puppet gets a record deal. The hand puppet gets a celebrity boyfriend. The hand puppet gets fame and attention and commercial success. The genuine cultural contribution gets a participation ribbon and forgotten. Parker and Stone are making a specific argument about how Hollywood and the music industry have historically packaged Latino identity for mainstream consumption. The entertainment industry takes a complex, diverse cultural identity and reduces it to a few easily digestible symbols. Spicy food, accent humor, passionate temperament, exotic sexuality. These are the same stereotypical elements that Cartman's hand puppet deploys, and they're the same elements that actual entertainment products have used to market Latino artists to predominantly white audiences for decades. The episode isn't just mocking Cartman's racism, it's mocking the entire system that makes Cartman's version of Latino identity more commercially viable than the real thing. What makes Fat Butt and Pancake Head especially effective as satire is that it doesn't let anyone off the hook. Cartman is obviously guilty for creating the stereotype in the first place. But the judges who awarded him first place are guilty for rewarding it. The music industry that gave the puppet a record deal is guilty for monetizing it. Ben Affleck is guilty for being too superficial to tell the difference between a real person and a racist caricature. And the audience that consumed and enjoyed the taco-flavored kisses content is guilty for creating demand for exactly this kind of reductive cultural product. The episode also raises questions about the relationship between performer and performance that are more relevant now than they were in 2003. In the age of social media, cultural identities are constantly being performed, packaged, and sold. People build entire brands around simplified versions of their cultural backgrounds. The line between authentic cultural expression and marketable cultural stereotype has never been blurrier. Cartman's hand puppet is the most extreme version of this phenomenon, a cultural identity that is literally manufactured by someone who doesn't belong to the culture being represented. And it succeeds anyway because the audience doesn't care about authenticity. They care about entertainment. The fact that Cartman insists his hand has a mind of its own is also worth examining. Throughout the episode, there are moments where the show actually makes you wonder if the hand puppet might be genuinely autonomous. Cartman seems genuinely distressed by Affleck's romantic advances. He seems uncomfortable with some of the things Ms. Lopez says. There's a reading of the episode where the hand puppet has taken on a life of its own, and Cartman has lost control of the monster he created. This reading works as a metaphor for how cultural stereotypes, once released into the world, take on their own momentum and can't be recalled by their creators. The entertainment industry has created so many stereotypical images of Latino people that those images now exist independently of any individual creator's intentions. They reproduce themselves through casting decisions, marketing strategies, and audience expectations. The stereotype has become autonomous, just like Cartman claims his hand puppet is. Kyle's frustration throughout the episode is the frustration of anyone who has ever tried to create genuine, nuanced representation in a marketplace that rewards simplicity and familiarity. He did the work. He researched the real contributions of Latino Americans. He tried to present something that would actually educate his classmates. And he lost to a racist hand puppet because the racist hand puppet was more entertaining. That dynamic plays out in Hollywood constantly. Studios greenlight projects that rely on familiar cultural stereotypes because those projects are easy to market, and audiences already know what to expect. Projects that attempt more nuanced representation are riskier, harder to market, and often less commercially successful. The Kyles of the world keep losing to the Cartmans because the system is designed to reward Cartmans. By the end of the episode, the situation resolves itself in typically chaotic South Park fashion, but the underlying message lingers. Cultural stereotypes are profitable. The entertainment industry will always choose profitable stereotypes over unprofitable nuance. And the people most harmed by this system, the actual members of the cultures being stereotyped, are the ones least able to change it. Cartman wins, Kyle loses, the hand puppet goes on tour, and somewhere the real contributions of Latino Americans to technology, science, arts, and culture remain as underrepresented in popular media as they were before Cultural Diversity Day started. The Cartman hand puppet was a deliberately crude stereotype. But before we get to the show's biggest racial revelation, I want to take a step back and talk about something that connects all these episodes together. Because when you watch them one after another like this, you start to notice something about how South Park uses Cartman specifically as a vehicle for exploring racism, and why that approach is both brilliant and deeply uncomfortable. Eric Cartman is, by any objective measure, one of the most racist characters in the history of American television. He has used racial slurs against virtually every ethnic group. He has tried to start race wars for entertainment. He has created racist caricatures and insisted they have minds of their own. He has manipulated racial tensions to serve his personal interests. He dressed up as Hitler for Halloween and thought it was funny. He organized a rally against people he perceived as threatening and couldn't understand why anyone had a problem with it. By any standard, Cartman is a white supremacist in training, and the show has never shied away from that characterization. But here's what makes Cartman interesting in the context of racial satire rather than just offensive. Cartman doesn't think he's racist. In his own mind, he's simply speaking the truth. He thinks the world is organized around racial hierarchies, and that acknowledging those hierarchies is just being honest. When he calls someone a slur, he doesn't experience it as hatred. He experiences it as observation. This is actually a far more accurate depiction of how racism functions in the real world than most television shows are willing to present. Most racists don't see themselves as racists. They see themselves as realists. They think they're just saying what everyone else is thinking, and that political correctness is a conspiracy to prevent honest conversation about human differences. The show uses Cartman's racism in two distinct ways across the episodes we've been discussing. In some episodes, Cartman's racism is the punchline. His behavior is so extreme and so absurd that it functions as comedy through sheer outrageousness. The race war scene and with apologies to Jesse Jackson is a perfect example. Nobody is supposed to sympathize with Cartman in that moment. He's being ridiculous, and the humor comes from the gap between the seriousness of the situation and Cartman's gleeful attempt to escalate it. But in other episodes, Cartman's racism is the lens through which the show examines more subtle forms of prejudice. In Fat Butt and Pancake Head, Cartman creates a racist hand puppet, but the real target of the satire isn't Cartman. It's the system that rewards Cartman's racism over Kyle's genuine cultural engagement. Cartman wins first place at Cultural Diversity Day not because Cartman is clever, but because the judges, the audience, and the entertainment industry are all set up to reward exactly the kind of reductive stereotyping that Cartman provides. The system isn't designed by racists. It's designed by lazy people, incurious people, people who prefer familiar caricatures over challenging nuance. And Cartman exploits that laziness the way a virus exploits a weak immune system. This dual function of Cartman's character, sometimes the joke and sometimes the diagnostic tool, is what makes South Park's approach to race unique among animated shows. The Simpsons dealt with race through characters like Apu, who was himself a stereotype that the show eventually had to reckon with. Family Guy deals with race through shock humor that rarely reaches for deeper insight. South Park uses Cartman as a character who is simultaneously the problem, the symptom, and the mirror. He's the problem because his racism causes real harm to the people around him. He's the symptom because his attitudes are reflections of the culture he lives in. And he's the mirror because when you laugh at Cartman, you're laughing at something that exists, in diluted form in yourself. The episode Scott Tenorman Must Die, which has the highest IMDb rating of any South Park episode at 9.6 out of 10, isn't primarily about race, but it establishes something about Cartman's character that is essential for understanding how he functions in the racial episodes. In that episode, Cartman orchestrates the death of a teenager's parents and feeds them to him in Chile. The teenager mocked Cartman, and Cartman's response was genocide-level retaliation. This is the same psychology that drives his behavior in racial situations. Cartman doesn't just want to be racist, he wants to win, he wants to dominate, he wants to prove that he's smarter and more powerful than everyone around him. And racism is one of the tools he uses to establish that dominance. When Cartman creates a racist hand puppet, he's not trying to hurt Latino people specifically. He's trying to prove that his crude, simple version of the world is more powerful than Kyle's nuanced, educated version. And the terrifying thing is that he's usually right. This connects to a broader observation about how South Park treats the relationship between intelligence and morality. Rick Sanchez, in the reference material you showed me, operates on a similar principle. The smartest person in the room is often the most dangerous person in the room. But South Park adds a racial dimension to this that Rick and Morty doesn't explore as directly. In South Park, intelligence without empathy produces racism just as surely as ignorance does. The Council of Ricks exploits Mortys because they're smart enough to build a system of exploitation. The townspeople of South Park exploit each other's racial anxieties because they're smart enough to know which buttons to push but not empathetic enough to care about the damage they cause. Cartman represents the extreme version of this principle. He's not stupid. The show has made it clear repeatedly that Cartman is actually quite intelligent when he chooses to apply himself. He organized a scheme that resulted in someone's parents being killed and turned into food. He ran a successful presidential campaign at the Citadel. Wait, wrong show. He manipulated an entire town into thinking he had supernatural powers. His racism isn't the product of ignorance. It's the product of intelligence applied without moral constraint. And that's what makes it so much more dangerous than the relatively harmless racism of characters like Randy, who say racist things because they're panicking or overcompensating, not because they're strategically deploying prejudice for personal gain. The other boys' relationship to race is defined largely by their relationship to Cartman. Stan tries to be the opposite of Cartman. Where Cartman is cruel, Stan tries to be kind. Where Cartman is racist, Stan tries to be inclusive. But Stan's opposition to Cartman sometimes leads him into its own kind of failure. And with apologies to Jesse Jackson, Stan's desire to be the anti-Cartman, to prove he's not racist, prevents him from doing the one thing that would actually help, which is admitting that he doesn't understand. Kyle occupies a more complex position. He's Cartman's primary antagonist, the person who most consistently calls out Cartman's behavior. But Kyle is also the character most likely to engage seriously with racial issues on their own terms, as demonstrated by his genuine cultural research in Fat Butt and Pancake Head. Kenny, as always, exists on the margins, too poor and too dead to participate fully in the racial dynamics that drive the other characters' stories. Understanding these character dynamics is essential for understanding what the show does with its most ambitious racial episode. Because when South Park finally turned the lens on its own audience and its own history, it did it through these exact character relationships: Stan's guilt, Kyle's awareness, Cartman's obliviousness, and Tolkien's patience with all three of them. Now let's talk about South Park's most uncomfortable examination of tokenism, when the show revealed that one character's name had a completely different meaning than everyone assumed, and called the entire audience racist for not realizing it. The Big Fix is the episode where South Park pulled off one of the most audacious meta-jokes in television history. After 25 years of having a black character whose name everyone assumed was a commentary on his status as the show's token minority character, the show revealed that his name was never what anyone thought it was, and in doing so, it called its own audience racist. The episode aired on February 9th, 2022 during season 25, And it's one of those moments where you realize that Parker and Stone have been playing a much longer game than anyone gave them credit for. To understand why this episode hits so hard, you need to understand the history of the character. Since the show's early seasons, the boy's black classmate has been known as Token Black. The joke was right there in the name. He was the token black character in a show set in a predominantly white Colorado mountain town. South Park was being self-aware about its own lack of diversity by literally naming its one black character Token. Audiences understood this. Critics understood this. Academic papers about representation in animated television referenced it. The character's name was the show's way of acknowledging and making fun of its own tokenism. Everybody knew the joke. Everybody was in on it, or so they thought. The Big Fix opens with Randy attending a cannabis cultivators expo at the Colorado Convention Center. He's high naturally because this is Randy, and he runs a marijuana farm called Tegrity Farms. At the expo, he attends a panel where industry experts discuss how consumers are increasingly demanding that their marijuana be grown by people of color who understand social equity. White-owned weed businesses might face boycotts if they don't demonstrate commitment to diversity. Randy, hearing this, does what Randy always does. He panics and overcompensates. He goes home and sits down with his family and makes an observation. They have no black friends. He questions why Stan doesn't hang out more with his black classmate, pointing out that they only interact in larger groups. Stan, feeling guilty about this, decides to invite Tolkien and his family over for dinner. And this is where the first bombshell drops. At dinner, Randy is being his usual awkwardly friendly self. He takes photographs of the families together, trying to document their interracial friendship like it's a tourist attraction. Then he asks Tolkien's parents why they named their son Token. The family is confused. Steve Black, Tolkien's father, explains that he's a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and named his son after the famous author. Randy processes this. The audience processes this. Stan processes this. The character's name is Tolkien, Tolkien, named after the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It was never Token. It was always Tolkien. Everyone in the show's universe knew this. Everyone except the audience watching at home. Stan calls Kyle to ask if he knew the name was Tolkien, and Kyle confirms that yes, he and everyone else always knew. Stan then calls Cartman, who is wearing a shirt that says, "Token's life matters" on it. Cartman is genuinely surprised to learn that the name is spelled with an L. This is perfect character work. Kyle, the morally aware kid, always knew. Cartman, the self-proclaimed anti-racist who wears performative solidarity merchandise, assumed the wrong name just like the audience did. And Stan, who represents the average well-meaning white person, is caught somewhere in between, mortified by his own assumption and desperate to fix it. What makes this revelation so devastating is that it works retroactively. Every time the audience laughed at the Token Black name over 25 years, they were revealing their own assumptions about why a black character would be named that way. The show gave them two possible interpretations. Either the name was a meta-joke about tokenism, which assumes the show's creators think of their black character primarily as a token, or the name was a reference to a beloved author, which treats the character as a person with parents who have their own interests and passions that have nothing to do with race. The audience overwhelmingly chose the first interpretation. The show let them sit in that choice for a quarter century and then told them they were wrong. Stan's reaction to discovering his mistake is the emotional center of the episode. He's genuinely distressed. He visits a doctor without his parents' knowledge and tells the doctor he's concerned about being racist. The doctor is friendly and supportive at first, until Stan admits that he thought Tolkien's name was Token. The doctor's demeanor changes instantly. He becomes hostile, tells Stan to leave his office, and suggests he read from the perspective of a black person if he wants to improve. This scene is doing something really clever. The doctor's reaction seems extreme until you think about what Stan's assumption actually reveals. To assume that a black family would name their child Token as a reference to their minority status is to assume that black parents define their children's identities around race rather than around their own interests, passions, and cultural tastes. It reduces black parenthood to a function of racial politics rather than treating it as the normal human act of naming a child after something you love. Stan, being Stan, overcompensates in the worst possible way. He reads The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and becomes obsessed with making things right. He organizes a J.R.R. Tolkien Appreciation Day at school. He does a presentation suggesting that the Tolkien books be made required reading so that his classmate Tolkien won't feel isolated. He insists that Tolkien leave the room during this presentation because Stan is so focused on performing allyship that he doesn't bother to consult the actual person he's supposedly helping. The entire school confirms that they always knew their classmate was named after the author. Stan is the only one who didn't know. At the school assembly for Tolkien Appreciation Day, Stan gives a heartfelt speech about the books, and then invites Tolkien to the stage to share his thoughts. And Tolkien delivers the episode's funniest and most cutting line. He says he doesn't enjoy the books at all. He has always hated them. He can't stand them. He drops the microphone and walks off stage. This is the show pointing out the absurdity of Stan's approach. Stan assumed that because Tolkien is named after J.R.R. Tolkien, he must love J.R.R. Tolkien's work. He projected his own guilt-driven narrative onto Tolkien without ever asking Tolkien what he actually thinks or wants. This is the same mistake white allyship makes constantly, making assumptions about what will help a person of color based on what makes the white person feel better about themselves, rather than actually listening to the person they're supposedly helping. The Randy subplot in this episode is equally devastating, but in a different way. After learning about the push for diversity in the cannabis industry, Randy partners with Steve Black to make his marijuana business look more inclusive. He puts up billboards of himself and Steve together. He calls Steve his partner, comparing them to Ben and Jerry of the ice cream company. But the comparison reveals exactly how Randy sees the relationship. Ben and Jerry is a duo where both partners contribute equally. Randy explicitly says that in their version, Jerry doesn't actually do anything. Steve is a prop. He's there to make Randy's business look diverse without actually sharing power, profit, or creative input. Steve tries to contribute. He suggests a cannabis line based on Lord of the Rings, featuring all 9 races of Middle-earth. It's actually a creative and marketable idea. But Randy and his business partner Towley shoot it down as dorky and refuse to let Steve have any real influence over the business. Steve is invited to events but not welcome to participate. He's visible but irrelevant. He's exactly what his family's name sounded like to the audience for 25 years, a token. When Steve realizes what's happening, he quits. He opens his own farm called Credigree Weed across the street from Tegrity Farms. He starts selling the exact cannabis ideas that Randy rejected, and customers start going to his shop instead. Randy, rather than admitting he was wrong to dismiss Steve's contributions, accuses Steve of stealing his ideas and kicks Tolkien out of the house, calling him a spy. He declares war between the 2 farms. The racial dynamics of the situation are impossible to miss. A white business owner exploits a black partner for diversity optics, dismisses his ideas, and then when the black partner succeeds independently, the white owner accuses him of theft and escalates to conflict. The episode ends with Dr. Ghosh addressing the camera directly. He delivers a message to the audience at home. He says that many people suffer from unconscious biases. He explains that anyone watching who also thought Tolkien's name was Token is part of the problem. And he provides a hotline number for them to call. 1-800-I-am-a-giant piece of shit. That closing moment is South Park at its most confrontational. The show isn't just satirizing racism in the fictional town of South Park. It's directly accusing its own viewers of the same unconscious bias it's been depicting on screen. For 25 years, the audience assumed a black character was named after a racial concept rather than a beloved author. The show let them make that assumption and then punish them for it. It's a mirror held up to millions of viewers, and what those viewers see in that mirror is deeply unflattering. The meta-narrative of this episode is the most interesting thing about it. Parker and Stone created the character in the late 90s, during a period when self-aware tokenism was considered edgy and progressive. The joke of having a character named Token was supposed to be a commentary on the lack of diversity in the show. But over time, the joke stopped being a commentary and started being the actual thing it was commenting on. The character was Token. He had limited storylines, minimal development, and his name was the most notable thing about him. By revealing that the name was always Tolkien, Parker and Stone are retroactively rewriting their own history. They're saying that the joke was never what you thought it was, and they're forcing the audience to confront their complicity in the joke. Whether you buy this retroactive rewrite is a legitimate question. Some viewers felt that the Tolkien reveal was a genuine long-term plan. Others felt it was Parker and Stone covering for a joke that had aged poorly by inventing a new meaning after the fact. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The creator saw an opportunity to turn an old joke into a new commentary, and they executed it with the precision and ruthlessness that has defined the show for nearly 3 decades. Regardless of whether the reveal was planned from the beginning or invented in 2022, the effect on the audience was the same. It made people question their own assumptions about race, names, and the stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are. The Big Fix also functions as a commentary on the broader cultural reckoning around race that intensified after 2020. Stan's behavior in the episode, his performative allyship, his guilt-driven overcompensation, his refusal to actually listen to the black person he's supposedly helping, mirrors the behavior of millions of well-meaning white Americans who suddenly became very interested in racial justice without necessarily understanding how to practice it effectively. The Tolkien Appreciation Day that nobody asked for is the fictional equivalent of every corporate diversity initiative, every white people reading list, every performative social media post that prioritizes the poster's feelings over the community's actual needs. Randy's storyline is even more pointed in this regard. His partnership with Steve Black is the corporate version of the same dynamic. Hire a black person for optics, put them in the marketing materials, invite them to events, but don't actually give them power or listen to their ideas. Use their presence to deflect criticism of your own whiteness without making any structural changes to how your business operates. When Steve finally asserts himself and succeeds independently, Randy treats it as a betrayal rather than a natural consequence of being dismissed and exploited. The episode's treatment of Cartman in this context is subtle but important. Cartman, wearing his Tokens Life Matters shirt, is the performative ally taken to its most extreme and most honest form. He doesn't care about racial justice. He wears the shirt because it makes him look good, or because he thinks it's funny, or because it gives him social capital. When he learns that the name is Tolkien, he's surprised but not devastated the way Stan is. Cartman doesn't have the emotional investment in being a good person that Stan does. He doesn't care about his own biases because he doesn't see them as problems. In a weird way, Cartman's indifference is more honest than Stan's guilt. At least Cartman isn't pretending to be something he's not. The Tolkien reveal changed the character's trajectory in the show going forward. After the Big Fix, the character's name was officially changed to Tolkien in all credits and promotional materials. The South Park wiki and fan communities updated their records. It was a permanent change, not a one-episode gag. Parker and Stone committed to the reveal, which suggests they see it as more than just a joke. It was a statement about how the show relates to its own history and how the audience relates to the show. What makes The Big Fix resonate so deeply is that it asks a simple question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. If you spent 25 years thinking a black character was named Token, what does that say about you? Maybe it says you were in on the joke. Maybe it says you understood the show's self-aware commentary on tokenism. Or maybe it says you assumed a black family would define their child's identity around race rather than around literature, and you never questioned that assumption because it felt natural to you. The episode doesn't tell you which interpretation is correct. It just asks the question and lets you sit with your answer. Remember to subscribe to our channel. The Tolkien reveal was South Park holding a mirror up to its own audience. But now let's go back to a much earlier season when the show tackled something even more directly. What happens when rich black families move into a white neighborhood, and somehow the episode predicted gentrification discourse 20 years early? Here Comes the Neighborhood is the episode where South Park replaced the word black with the word rich, and showed exactly how racism works when you strip away the specific vocabulary. The episode aired on November 28, 2001 during Season 5, and it's one of the most structurally clever things Parker and Stone have ever written because it creates a perfect allegory for racial discrimination without ever technically mentioning race. Every single anti-black argument in American history is deployed in this episode, but directed at wealthy people instead. And the fact that it still works, that the bigotry still makes sense even with the target swapped, is the whole point. The episode starts with Tolkien, who was still known as Token at the time, feeling like an outsider at school. But his isolation isn't about race. It's about money. his family is by far the wealthiest in South Park. They have a huge house, nice cars, and access to things that the other kids' families can't afford. Tolkien feels different from his classmates not because of his skin color, but because of his economic status. He can't relate to kids who think eating at Bennigan's is a special occasion when his family dines at five-star restaurants. Feeling lonely, Tolkien writes letters to wealthy celebrities asking them to move to South Park so he'll have peers who understand his lifestyle. And it works. Rich black families start moving into town. Will Smith, Oprah Winfrey, Snoop Dogg, Kobe Bryant, and other wealthy celebrities all relocate to South Park. They buy properties, open businesses, and begin integrating into the community. The influx of wealthy newcomers changes the character of the town in ways that make the existing residents deeply uncomfortable. Now here's where the genius of the episode kicks in. The townspeople of South Park never once mention race. Not a single character says anything about the newcomers being black. Instead, they express their discomfort entirely in economic terms. They call them richers. They complain about property values changing. They worry about their neighborhood losing its character. They resent the way the newcomers flaunt their wealth and look down on the established residents. Every complaint is framed around money and class, not race. But the visual storytelling tells a completely different story. Every new family is black. The existing residents are all white. The complaints about richers use the exact same cadence, the exact same emotional register, and the exact same logical structure as complaints about black people moving into white neighborhoods. When the townspeople say, "We don't want your kind here," they're technically talking about rich people, but the audience can see what's actually happening. Parker and Stone created a scenario where the text says one thing and the subtext says something completely different, and the gap between those two things is where the satire lives. Mr. Garrison, who has always been one of the show's most reliably terrible people, takes the lead in opposing the new residents. His methods are transparently based on the tactics of white supremacist organizations. He organizes nighttime rallies where the townspeople wear white ghost costumes to scare the newcomers away. They burn lowercase t shapes on the new family's lawns, claiming it stands for time to leave. The visual reference to KKK cross burnings is impossible to miss, but Garrison maintains the fiction that this is about economic class, not race. He's a racist who won't admit he's a racist, which is arguably more dangerous than a racist who's honest about it. The scene where the townspeople are driving around in a pickup truck wearing ghost costumes and screaming at the wealthy families to leave is one of the most uncomfortably accurate depictions of racial intimidation that South Park has ever produced. The imagery is taken directly from the history of white supremacist violence against black communities. But because the characters insist they're only angry about wealth, they can participate in racist behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. This is exactly how modern racism often operates. People express prejudice through proxy issues like property values, school quality, and neighborhood character, allowing them to act on racial bias without ever having to acknowledge that race is a factor. The kids, as is often the case in South Park, represent a more innocent perspective. Stan, Kyle, and the other boys don't understand why the adults are upset about the new families. They just see Tolkien as a kid who has cool stuff. The fact that the new families are black doesn't register with them as relevant information. This echoes the colorblindness theme from Chef Go's Nanners, and it serves the same function. The children's inability to see the racial dimension of the situation highlights how much of racism is learned behavior rather than natural instinct. The adults learn to associate race with threat. The kids haven't learned that lesson yet. What makes Here Comes the Neighborhood prophetic is how precisely it describes the dynamics of gentrification and neighborhood change that would become a dominant cultural conversation in the decades following its airing. The townspeople's complaints about richers changing the character of their community are almost identical to the complaints made by long-term residents in gentrifying neighborhoods across America. The difference is that in real-world gentrification, the wealthy newcomers are usually white, and the displaced residents are usually people of color. South Park inverts this dynamic, making the wealthy newcomers black and the existing residents white. But the structural complaint is the same. New money comes in, old culture goes out, and the people who were there first feel erased. By swapping the races, the show forces the audience to examine the structure of the complaint independently from the specific identities involved. When wealthy white people move into a historically black neighborhood and the existing residents complain, many Americans sympathize with the existing residents. But when the episode presents the same dynamic with reversed races, the audience has to confront whether their sympathy is based on the structure of displacement or on which group is being displaced. If you only care about gentrification when it affects people who look like you, your concern isn't really about gentrification, it's about race. The episode also functions as a commentary on the relationship between race and class in America. The wealthy black families in the episode are discriminated against using the language of classism, but the discrimination is clearly motivated by racism. The townspeople pretend their problem is money, but their methods, the ghost costumes, the burning T shapes, the intimidation campaigns, are all borrowed from the playbook of racial terrorism. This reflects a real dynamic in American society where racial prejudice often disguises itself as class resentment. People who would never say they have a problem with black neighbors will say they have a problem with certain kinds of neighbors, or that the neighborhood is changing, or that property values are being affected. The vocabulary changes, but the sentiment stays the same. The wealthy black families eventually leave South Park, driven out by the harassment campaign. The townspeople celebrate getting rid of the richers, completely oblivious to what their behavior actually represents. The episode ends with the status quo restored, which is its own kind of commentary. The system of exclusion works. The threat to the existing order is expelled, and the people who did the expelling convince themselves that it had nothing to do with race. Here Comes the Neighborhood sits at the intersection of several themes that South Park returns to constantly in its racial episodes. The gap between what people say and what they mean, the way children see the world differently from adults, the relationship between economic anxiety and racial prejudice, the mechanisms through which communities maintain racial homogeneity while insisting they're not racist. These themes recur because they reflect persistent features of American society that haven't changed much since the show began. And this feels like the right place to step back and look at the broader patterns in how South Park handles race across its entire run. Because when you line up all these episodes, from Chef Goes Nanners in 2000 to The Big Fix in 2022, you can see a consistent philosophy at work. It's not always comfortable, it's not always right, but it's always deliberate. The first pattern is how the show uses its four main characters as different instruments for examining race. Cartman is the racism stress test. He says what society thinks but won't admit. His racism isn't subtle or hidden, it's loud, proud, and unapologetic. He calls people slurs to their faces. He tries to start race wars for entertainment. He creates racist hand puppets and insists they're autonomous. Cartman's function in the show's racial episodes is to externalize the racism that other characters and the audience keep internal. When Cartman says something horrible about race, the audience gets to feel superior to him. But the show constantly reminds you that Cartman's attitudes don't come from nowhere. He lives in the same society you do. He watches the same media. He absorbs the same cultural messages. The only difference between Cartman and most people is that Cartman says what he thinks out loud. Stan represents the well-meaning white person who wants to do the right thing but doesn't know how. In With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, Stan spends the entire episode trying to fix the situation with Tolkien, and failing because he's approaching it from his own perspective rather than Tolkien's. In The Big Fix, he overcompensates for his bias by creating a Tolkien Appreciation Day that nobody asked for. Stan's mistakes are the mistakes of liberal white America. He means well, he genuinely cares about his black friend. But his understanding of what that care should look like is shaped by his own cultural position, and he keeps defaulting to gestures that make himself feel better rather than actions that actually help. Kyle functions as the moral compass who usually arrives at the most nuanced position by the end of each episode. In Chef Goes Nanners, Kyle is on the team defending the flag, but only because he doesn't see the racial element. His innocence is genuine, not performed. In Fat Butt and Pancake Head, Kyle is the one who did the actual cultural research, who took the assignment seriously, who represents what real engagement with diversity looks like. Kyle doesn't always get it right, but he's usually trying harder and thinking more carefully than the other characters. Kenny exists in these episodes mostly as a reminder that class intersects with race in complicated ways. Kenny's family is the poorest in South Park. He wears a parka that muffles his voice. He dies constantly and nobody seems to care. In a show about race, Kenny represents the dimension of economic deprivation that crosscuts racial identity. Poor white families like the McCormicks share some of the material conditions of racial minorities without sharing their specific cultural experiences. Kenny rarely has a significant role in the racial episodes, but his presence is a constant reminder that privilege and disadvantage aren't distributed solely along racial lines. Chef, voiced by Isaac Hayes from 1997 through his departure in 2006, was the show's most important character for racial commentary during its first decade. Chef was the adult the kids turned to when they didn't understand something, and he was the only regularly recurring black adult in the show. He served as a moral compass who could cut through the town's collective stupidity and explain what was really happening in racial situations. When Chef left the show, after Hayes objected to the Scientology episode Trapped in the Closet in Season 10, the show lost its primary vehicle for addressing race from a black perspective. The racial episodes that followed Chef's departure had to find different approaches, which is why later episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson and The Big Fix focus more on white characters' reactions to race rather than on black characters' experiences of it. The shift was necessary, but it also changed the nature of the show's racial commentary. Without a black voice in the room, the show's perspective on race became more observational and less experiential. The show's approach to race has also evolved with its production philosophy. South Park's unprecedented 6-day production cycle, documented in the 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, allows Parker and Stone to write, animate, and deliver episodes within days of real-world events. This means the show can respond to racial controversies almost in real time. When Michael Richards had his meltdown in November 2006, the show had an episode about it ready by March 2007. When the cultural reckoning around racial justice intensified after 2020, the show was exploring performative allyship and unconscious bias within 2 years. This speed gives South Park a unique position in the landscape of racial commentary. It can engage with the conversation while the conversation is still happening, which means its commentary feels urgent and current in a way that other animated shows, which typically have production cycles of 8 to 9 months per episode, can never achieve. The production technology also matters. South Park has been animated using Autodesk Maya since Season 5, which began in 2001. The entire pre-2009 catalog was later re-rendered from archived animation files to full HD. The show has maintained its signature cutout paper aesthetic throughout, which creates an interesting visual framework for racial commentary. The characters are deliberately simple, almost primitive in their design. The black characters are drawn with the same basic shapes as the white characters. The visual simplicity means that racial differences are communicated through skin color and nothing else. There are no exaggerated features, no caricatured proportions, no visual stereotypes beyond color. This design choice means that when the show deals with race, it has to do so through writing and story rather than through visual caricature, which forces a level of sophistication that shows with more detailed animation styles sometimes lack. Parker and Stone's overarching philosophy on race can be summarized in a single principle that runs through every episode we've discussed. The best way to combat racism is to make it look stupid rather than forbidden. They don't tell you not to be racist. They show you what racism looks like from the outside and let you decide whether you want to be the person saying, "They took our jobs," or the person burning lowercase t shapes on someone's lawn while insisting it's not about race. Their approach isn't, "Don't say racist things." It's, "Say racist things and watch how dumb they sound out loud." This philosophy has earned them both a Peabody Award in 2005, specifically citing their distinguished and biting social commentary, and constant controversy from people who believe that depicting racism, even to mock it, normalizes racism. Whether you agree with that philosophy depends on what you believe satire is supposed to do. If you think satire should model correct behavior, then South Park's approach is dangerous because it puts racist language and imagery on screen without always providing an explicit corrective. If you think satire should reveal the absurdity of existing behavior, then South Park's approach is effective because it makes racism look as foolish as it actually is. The debate about which approach is more effective has been going on since the show premiered, and it will probably continue for as long as the show keeps airing. Now let's talk about the era that changed everything, when South Park stopped just making fun of racism and started making fun of the people who think they're fighting it. For the first 18 seasons of South Park, the show's approach to race was straightforward. Racists were stupid, racism was absurd, and the best response to both was laughter. But starting in season 19, which premiered on September 16, 2015, something changed. Parker and Stone introduced a character that didn't just make fun of racists, he made fun of the people who fight racism. And in doing so, they created one of the most controversial and misunderstood eras in the show's history. PC Principal arrived at South Park Elementary in the season premiere episode titled Stunning and Brave. And from his very first scene, he was a different kind of antagonist than the show had ever created. He's not stupid, he's not weak, he's not a caricature of a liberal stereotype. PC Principal is a physically imposing, deeply committed advocate for social justice who genuinely believes that policing language and enforcing progressive norms is making the world better. He's also incredibly aggressive about it. His idea of combating prejudice is to beat the crap out of anyone who says something offensive. In his debut episode, PC Principal establishes dominance at South Park Elementary by physically assaulting Cartman for calling Kyle's mom a slur, not verbally confronting him, not sending him to detention, beating him unconscious. The other kids are terrified, the staff is overwhelmed. And Cartman, who has spent the entire series saying whatever he wants without physical consequences, is suddenly face to face with someone who responds to offensive speech with immediate violence. For the first time in the show's history, Cartman's mouth has gotten him into trouble he can't talk his way out of. PC Principal also brings with him the PC Bros, a fraternity of physically fit, college-age men who have adopted progressive politics as their brand identity. They wear Oakley sunglasses, drink protein shakes, and aggressively check privilege at every opportunity. They move into South Park and immediately start policing the town's language, social dynamics, and cultural attitudes. They're the embodiment of a very specific cultural moment in the mid-2000s when progressive politics, campus activism, and social media call-out culture converged into something that looked from the outside more like a fraternity hazing ritual than a liberation movement. The central conflict of Stunning and Brave revolves around Caitlyn Jenner. Kyle, who is usually the show's moral voice, refuses to publicly declare that Caitlyn Jenner is stunning and brave. He doesn't say anything transphobic, he doesn't express any opinion about Jenner's identity. He simply doesn't want to be forced to say words he hasn't chosen to say. PC Principal treats this refusal as an act of bigotry. He demands that Kyle make a public statement affirming Jenner's beauty and courage. Kyle is pressured from every direction. His friends, his family, the school administration, and the PC Bros all want him to say the words. The implication is clear. If you don't say what the progressive consensus demands you say, you will be treated as though you said the worst thing imaginable. This is the episode that divided South Park's audience in a way that hadn't happened before. Progressive viewers saw it as an attack on social justice and trans rights. Conservative viewers saw it as a vindication of their belief that political correctness was out of control. And a third group, probably the group Parker and Stone were actually writing for, saw it as a commentary on how genuine progressive values can be weaponized by people who are more interested in policing behavior than in actually making the world more equitable. PC Principal is the key to understanding what the show is doing in this era. He's not presented as wrong about his values, he's presented as wrong about his methods. The show doesn't argue that racial equality is bad, or that respecting transgender people is wrong, or that progressive politics are inherently misguided. It argues that enforcing progressive values through intimidation, social pressure, and physical violence undermines the very principles those values are supposed to represent. Freedom of thought becomes mandatory thinking. Inclusion becomes exclusion of anyone who doesn't perform inclusion correctly. And allyship becomes a competitive sport where the goal is to be more progressive than the person next to you rather than to actually help anyone. What's remarkable about PC Principal is that he didn't remain a one-episode joke. Parker and Stone kept him as a permanent character. He became the principal of South Park Elementary and stayed there through multiple subsequent seasons. This was a deliberate choice. They could have dispatched PC Principal the way they dispatch most topical characters, one episode, and done. But they saw something deeper in the character that was worth exploring over time. And as the show continued, PC Principal evolved from a parody into something more complex. He started a relationship with a character named Strong Woman. They had children together. He showed moments of genuine compassion and self-doubt. He became a person rather than a punchline. This evolution is important because it reflects how Parker and Stone's relationship with political correctness evolved as well. In 2015, when the PC principal era began, the cultural conversation was dominated by debates about campus speech codes, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and the boundaries of acceptable discourse. These were genuine flashpoints in American culture, and South Park tackled them with its typical irreverence. But as the years went on, the conversation shifted. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 changed the political landscape in ways that made pure anti-PC comedy feel insufficient. Suddenly, the people complaining about political correctness were the ones in power, and the people advocating for progressive values were the ones being marginalized. Parker and Stone, to their credit, adapted. Season 20, which aired in 2016, was the show's most heavily serialized season. It told a single continuous story across all 10 episodes, dealing with internet trolling, the presidential election, and the ways that online harassment intersects with racial and gender politics. Mr. Garrison, who had already established himself as one of the show's most morally reprehensible characters, transformed into a direct analog of Donald Trump. He ran for president on a platform of pure provocation, saying whatever outrageous thing came to mind and gaining support precisely because of how offensive he was. The season's villain was an internet troll named SkankHunt42, who targeted women and minorities online with harassment campaigns that were designed to destabilize communities and make people turn against each other. The Member Berries, a group of sentient, nostalgia-inducing berries that appeared throughout the season, represented the show's take on how racism hides inside nostalgia. The berries start by making characters remember innocent things, old movies, classic TV shows, the way things used to be. But gradually, the memories become darker. The berries start referencing a time when certain people knew their place, when social hierarchies were unchallenged, when the dominant culture didn't have to share space with anyone else. The Member Berries are essentially the Make America Great Again slogan in fruit form, reminding people that the past they're nostalgic for was only great for some people, and that the desire to return to that past is inseparable from the desire to return to its racial hierarchies. Season 20 received mixed reviews, partly because the serialized format didn't work as well for South Park's style, and partly because the 2016 election produced an outcome that nobody, including Parker and Stone, expected. The show had reportedly planned different storylines based on the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win, and when Trump won instead, they had to scramble to rewrite their ending. This was one of the few times the show's 6-day production cycle wasn't fast enough to keep up with reality. But the racial themes from the PC principal era continued to develop in subsequent seasons. Season 21 dealt with white supremacist rallies and online radicalization. Season 22 explored the ways that school shooting anxiety intersects with racial politics. Season 23, which included the episode Banned in China that got the entire franchise banned in mainland China, examined how American corporations censor themselves to maintain access to Chinese markets, which is itself a form of racial and political accommodation. The China ban deserves special attention because it demonstrates the real-world consequences of South Park's approach to racial and cultural satire. The episode Banned in China criticized Hollywood studios for editing their films to avoid offending the Chinese government. It depicted Winnie the Pooh, who had been banned in China as a caricature of President Xi Jinping, imprisoned in a concentration camp alongside other characters who had been deemed offensive by Chinese censors. The Chinese government's response was total and immediate. The entire South Park franchise was scrubbed from the Chinese internet. All episodes were removed from streaming platforms. Search terms related to the show were blocked on Baidu, Douban, Zhihu, Bilibili, Sina Weibo, and WeChat. Parker and Stone's response was a mock apology that read, in part, like something Cartman would write, dripping with sarcasm while appearing to comply with Chinese demands. The incident demonstrated that South Park's equal opportunity offensiveness wasn't just an artistic choice. It was a genuine commitment to saying things that powerful entities don't want said, regardless of the financial consequences. The most recent seasons have continued to evolve the show's racial commentary. Season 25 in 2022 gave us the Big Fix and the Tolkien Revelation, which we already covered. Season 27, which aired in 2025, featured a highly serialized narrative centering on a caricature of Donald Trump in his second administration, depicting an abusive romantic relationship between Trump and Satan. The racial politics of the Trump era were woven throughout the season, with episodes dealing with surveillance, political intimidation, and the ways that authoritarian politics exploit racial divisions. Season 28, also in 2025, took an even stranger turn. The boys became obsessed with an internet meme that billionaire Peter Thiel investigated as a potential cult. Trump and J.D. Vance conspired to secretly abort Satan's baby. PC Principal physically fought Jesus Christ over the direction of modern Christianity. A storyline followed Cartman's conversion to Christianity, exploring how religious identity intersects with racial and political identity in contemporary America. The show earned a Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Animated Series in 2025, suggesting that even as it pushes boundaries, the critical establishment recognizes its ongoing relevance. What ties all of these seasons together is a consistent thesis about race that has evolved but never fundamentally changed since the show's premiere in 1997. That thesis goes something like this: racism is stupid. Anti-racism can also be stupid. The only intelligent response to both is to maintain the ability to think independently and resist the pressure to conform to any orthodoxy, whether that orthodoxy comes from the right or the left. This is why the show makes fun of rednecks screaming, "They took our jobs," and college bros screaming about privilege with equal enthusiasm. It's why Cartman's overt racism and Stan's performative allyship are both treated as problems. It's why the show can create an episode praising the NAACP's response and then, 15 years later, call its own audience racist for making assumptions about a character's name. The production context that makes all of this possible is worth appreciating. South Park is one of the longest-running animated series in American television history. It premiered on August 13, 1997, and as of its season 28 finale on December 10, 2025, has produced 338 episodes across 28 seasons. In July 2025, creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone signed a $1.5 billion extension deal with Paramount Global, guaranteeing 50 new episodes and securing the show through at least 2029 or 2030. The show boosted Comedy Central's subscriber base from approximately 9 million to 50 million households during its late 1990s peak. Season 27's premiere drew 5.9 million cross-platform viewers in its first 3 days, a 68% increase over the previous season's premiere and the biggest Comedy Central debut share since 1999. These numbers matter because they mean that South Park's racial commentary reaches an enormous audience. When the show makes a statement about race, millions of people hear it. When it creates a catchphrase like, "They took our jobs," that phrase enters the cultural vocabulary and shapes how people talk about real issues. When it reveals that a character's name was always Tolkien, millions of viewers have to confront their own assumptions. South Park has more influence over how Americans think about race than most academic papers, political speeches, or editorial columns. That influence comes with responsibility, and whether Parker and Stone are handling that responsibility well is a question the show itself seems to enjoy asking. The 6-day production cycle that allows the show to comment on current events in near real time is powered by approximately 70 personnel, including animators, editors, and sound engineers, who work 100 to 120-hour weeks. Finalized episodes are sometimes transmitted to Comedy Central via satellite uplink just hours before the 10 p.m. broadcast. This was documented in the 2011 documentary, 6 Days to Air, The Making of South Park. The speed of production means that when a racial controversy erupts in American culture, South Park can have an episode about it on the air before most people have finished arguing about it on social media. This gives the show a unique function in the cultural ecosystem. It's not just commenting on racial discourse, it's participating in it in real time. Looking back at every episode we've covered tonight, from With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, through Chef Goes Nanners, Goobacks, Chinpokomon, Fat Butt, and Pancake Head, The Big Fix, Here Comes the Neighborhood, and the PC Principal era, a clear through line emerges. South Park's approach to race has always been to make the audience uncomfortable. Not to validate their existing beliefs, not to tell them they're right, not to provide easy answers, but to put them in a position where every possible response reveals something about themselves. If you laughed at "They took our jobs," the show asks why you found inarticulate bigotry funny. If you cringed at Randy saying the slur on Wheel of Fortune, the show asks whether your discomfort is about the word itself or about seeing yourself in Randy's panic. If you assume Tolkien's name was Token for 25 years, the show asks what that assumption says about your default view of Black identity. If you cheered when PC Principal punched Cartman, the show asks whether violence in service of progressive values is really different from violence in service of regressive ones. Every episode is a trap. And every trap is designed to make you think more carefully about race than you were thinking before you pressed play. The traps don't always work. Sometimes the satire misfires. Sometimes the both sides framing creates false equivalences. Sometimes the show's privileged perspective, as two wealthy white men from Colorado, limits what they can see and say about racial experiences they haven't lived. Parker and Stone would probably be the first to admit that they don't have all the answers about race in America. But they've been asking the questions for nearly 3 decades, and the questions keep getting sharper even as the answers keep getting more complicated. The thing that really gets me about South Park's racial episodes is how they interact with the show's fundamental structure. South Park is a comedy. It exists to make people laugh. And yet, its most effective racial commentary happens not when it's being funny, but when it's being honest. Stan's admission that he'll never understand what Tolkien experiences. Chef's realization that his own anti-racism was becoming a form of racism. The moment when you, sitting at home watching The Big Fix, realized you'd been wrong about a character's name for 25 years. Those aren't jokes. They're moments of genuine insight delivered inside a framework of comedy. And they work better than they would in a drama because the comedy disarms you. You're not expecting to learn something about yourself while watching an animated show where a kid dies every episode. The humor gets past your defenses, and by the time the insight lands, it's too late to deflect it. South Park has been on the air since 1997. It's survived cultural shifts that have destroyed other shows. It's adapted to streaming, to social media, to a post-Trump political landscape. It's been banned in multiple countries and celebrated by the Peabody Awards in the same decade. It has evolved from crude shock humor into something that, at its best, functions as genuine social commentary, even when that commentary is delivered by construction paper cutouts swearing at each other. The show's racial episodes represent some of its best and most challenging work, not because they provide answers, but because they refuse to let anyone, including their own audience, get comfortable. And that's what makes these episodes perfect for falling asleep to. Not because they're boring, they're not. But because the questions they raise keep turning over in your mind even after the screen goes dark. Why did you assume the name was Token? Why did you laugh at "They took our jobs"? What would you have done if you were Stan trying to talk to Tolkien after his dad said the word on national television? These aren't questions that resolve themselves easily. They're the kind of questions that follow you into sleep and are still there when you wake up. And maybe that's the most South Park thing of all, a show that makes you think about race while pretending it's just trying to make you laugh. Parker and Stone didn't set out to create the definitive television commentary on American race relations. They set out to make a funny show about 4 kids in Colorado. But somewhere along the way, their willingness to say things nobody else would say, to push past the boundaries of polite conversation, to offend everyone equally and let the chips fall where they may, produced something that is genuinely useful for understanding how America talks about race. Not because the show gets it right every time. It doesn't. But because it consistently refuses to let any position go unexamined, any assumption go unchallenged, or any audience member go unchallenged. South Park will keep making episodes about race because America will keep having problems with race. The show has been renewed through at least 2029 or 2030. That's another 5 or 6 years of opportunities to hold up the mirror and show us what we look like. Some of what we see will be funny, some of it will be uncomfortable, and some of it will be the kind of truth that only a cartoon can tell because a cartoon can say things that a real person never could. There's one more thing I want to address before we wrap up, because it's the elephant in the room with any discussion of South Park and race. The show is created by 2 white men from Colorado. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have never pretended to be anything other than what they are. They're not academics, they're not activists. They're comedians who happen to be really smart and really angry about hypocrisy in all its forms. Their perspective on race is inherently limited by their own experience, and that limitation shows up in their work in ways that are worth acknowledging. The most obvious limitation is that South Park's racial episodes are almost always told from a white perspective. with Apologies to Jesse Jackson is about Stan and Randy's experience with the fallout from a racial slur, not Tolkien's. Chef Goes Nanners gives Chef a significant role, but the resolution comes from the white children's colorblindness. The Big Fix is about Stan's guilt and Randy's performative allyship, not about Tolkien's experience of being reduced to a token. Here Comes the Neighborhood is about the white townspeople's reaction to black newcomers, not about the black family's experience of discrimination. The show consistently examines racism from the perspective of the people doing the racist things rather than the people experiencing them. This isn't necessarily a flaw. Parker and Stone are writing about what they know. They're white men exploring what it means to be white in a society that's wrestling with race. And there's genuine value in that exploration because white people's relationship to racism is one of the most important and least examined aspects of the problem. Most white Americans have never been forced to think seriously about how their racial identity affects their behavior, their assumptions, and their place in the social hierarchy. South Park forces that examination in a way that's uncomfortable and inescapable. When Stan admits he doesn't get it, that admission is directed at a predominantly white audience that also doesn't get it. When Randy says the word on national television and can't understand why his apology tour doesn't fix things, that confusion reflects the confusion of millions of white Americans who genuinely believe that racial reconciliation can be achieved through symbolic gestures alone. But the limitation is real. The show rarely depicts what racism feels like from the inside. Tolkien's perspective is almost always filtered through Stan's understanding of it. Chef's anger in Chef Goes Nanners is treated as excessive until it's recontextualized by the children's innocence. The time immigrants in Goobacks are a concept more than they are characters. The wealthy black families in Here Comes the Neighborhood are celebrities playing cameos, not fully developed people with inner lives. South Park is very good at showing what racism looks like from the outside. It's less equipped to show what racism feels like from the inside. And that gap matters because understanding racism requires both perspectives. Parker and Stone seem to be aware of this limitation. The Tolkien name change in The Big Fix was, among other things, an acknowledgement that the show had been reducing its black character to a racial concept for a quarter century. Renaming him after an author instead of a social phenomenon was an attempt to give the character an identity that exists independently of his racial function in the show. Whether this retroactive humanization fully compensates for 25 years of tokenism is debatable, but the fact that they attempted it suggests a level of self-awareness about their own blind spots that many creators lack. The show's legacy on race is ultimately mixed, which is appropriate for a show that has always insisted that mixed is more honest than pure. It has produced episodes that are genuinely insightful about how racism operates in American society. It has also produced episodes that use racial stereotypes for cheap laughs without enough satirical framework to justify them. It has created catchphrases that illuminate the absurdity of prejudice and catchphrases that have been adopted by actual prejudiced people without irony. It has pushed conversations forward, and it has sometimes pushed them sideways. But through 28 seasons and nearly 3 decades of production, South Park has never stopped engaging with race. It has never declared the conversation finished. It has never suggested that racism is solved or that any particular approach to addressing it is sufficient. The show keeps poking at the wound because the wound hasn't healed, and maybe keeping it visible is more useful than pretending it's not there. The fact that you're still watching, or possibly listening with your eyes closed at this point, means that something about how South Park approaches race connects with you. Maybe it's the honesty of admitting that racial issues don't have clean solutions. Maybe it's the humor that makes uncomfortable truths easier to swallow. Maybe it's the refusal to let anyone, left or right, escape examination. Or maybe it's just comforting to know that somewhere in the world, a show made of construction paper cutouts is still willing to say the things that real people are too afraid to say. That's it for this video. If you made it this far, or if you're just about to fall asleep, either way, you're appreciated. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.